Good morning. Welcome to the November 2019 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, could you please walk us through the agenda for the morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
For today's meeting, you will hear 7 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order that would ensure that Universal Service Fund support is not used to purchase equipment or services from companies posing a national security threat to the integrity of communications networks or the communications supply chain, propose additional actions to address national security threats to USF-funded networks, and collect information to help assess the extent to which equipment from covered companies already exists in such networks. Second, you will consider a 5th report and order and 5th notice of proposed rulemaking that would adopt a vertical or Z-axis location accuracy metric in connection with wireless E911 calls and propose additional measures to improve E911 location accuracy. Third, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on updating the Commission's suspension and debarment rules to make them consistent with Office of Management and Budget guidelines in order to better prevent bad actors from participating in Universal Service Fund programs, telecommunication relay services programs, and the National Deafblind Equipment Distribution Program. Fourth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on updating the Commission's unbundling and resale rules to reflect the marketplace realities of intermodal voice and broadband competition and to encourage both incumbent and competitive local exchange carriers to invest in next-generation networks. Fifth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on whether to authorize AM stations to transition to an all-digital signal on a voluntary basis. Sixth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on whether the duplicative programming rule applicable to commonly owned radio stations in the same market should be modified or eliminated given the current broadcasting marketplace. Seventh, you will consider a report and order that would expand the TRS fund contribution base for covering the costs of providing Internet Protocol Captioned Telephone service, IPCTS, to include intrastate telecommunications revenue as a way of strengthening the funding base for this form of TRS without increasing the size of the fund itself. This is your agenda for today. The first item, entitled Protecting Against National Security Threats to the Communications Supply Chain Through FCC Programs, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Monteith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. The Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order that, if adopted, will take critical next steps to protect our nation's communications networks. The draft item before you would ensure that public funds from the Commission's Universal Service Fund are not used in a way that undermines or poses a threat to our national security, while also seeking comment on further actions to address national security threats to our networks. This item was a team effort. I would like to thank the terrific staff from the Wireline Competition Bureau, as well as our colleagues in the Enforcement, International, Public Safety and Homeland Security, and Wireless Telecommunications Bureaus, and the Offices of Economics and Analytics, Engineering and Technology, and General Counsel. Seated at the table with me from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Trent Harkrader, Deputy Bureau Chief, and Justin Falb, Legal Advisor. From the Bureau's Telecommunications Access Policy Division, Ryan Palmer, Division Chief. From the Competition Policy Division, John Visklowski, Attorney Advisor. From the Pricing Policy Division, Aaron Garza, Deputy Division Chief. And from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Charles Mathias, Associate Bureau Chief. From the International Bureau, David Kretsch, Associate Division Chief, Telecommunications and Analysis Division. And from the Office of Economics and Analytics, Jeff Waldo, Industry Economist. Justin will now present the item.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, safeguarding the security and integrity of America's communications infrastructure has never been more important as our world becomes increasingly connected. Broadband networks have transformed virtually every aspect of the United States economy, enabling the voice, data, and internet connectivity that fuels not only our most critical industries, but also our infrastructure, including our transportation systems, electrical grids, financial markets, and emergency services. We are on the cusp of 5G, the next generation of wireless technologies, which is expected to deliver exponential increases in speed, responsiveness, and capacity. The crucial and transformative role of communications networks in our economy and society will only increase as these technologies age. It is therefore vital that we protect these networks and their supply chains from national security threats. The report and order before you, if adopted, would prospectively prohibit the use of universal service funds to purchase, obtain, maintain, improve, modify, or otherwise support any equipment or services produced or provided by a covered company posing a national security threat to the integrity of communications networks or the communication supply chain. Based on long-standing concerns, including by executive branch agencies and Congress, and the record before us, the order initially designates Huawei Technologies Company and ZTE Corp. As covered companies for the purposes of the rule, and establishes a process for designating additional covered companies in the future. Both companies' ties to the Chinese government and military apparatus, as well as Chinese laws obligating them to cooperate with any request from the Chinese government to use or access their systems, poses a threat to our national security and necessitates taking this step. Through the broad prohibition adopted in the item, the Commission best ensures that the Universal Service Fund support will not be used to undermine our national security, consistent with public safety and the public interests. In the accompanying further notice of proposed rulemaking, the Commission seeks comment on additional actions to address national security threats to communication networks. The further notice proposes to require, as a condition on the receipt of any USF support, that eligible telecommunication carriers, or ATCs, not use or agree not to use within a designated period of time communications equipment or services from covered companies. The further notice also proposes that the Commission require ETCs to remove and replace existing equipment and services provided by covered companies. To mitigate the impact on affected carriers, the further notice proposes to establish a reimbursement program to offset reasonable transition costs, and makes proposed remove and replace requirement contingent on the availability of a funded reimbursement mechanism. Finally, the item would adopt an information collection to help determine the extent to which equipment and services produced or provided by covered companies exist in current networks, and the costs associated with removing such equipment and replacing it with equivalent equipment. The Bureau recommends adoption of the report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking and order, and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Communications networks, whether wired or wireless, fixed or mobile, existing or yet to be deployed, are and will continue to be a central component of our daily lives. They are no longer just means to communicate with our friends and family, but facilitate how we conduct business, make financial transactions, engage in commerce, and obtain needed information. This will only expand in the coming years as next-generation networks could bring about such advances as self-driving vehicles, remote surgery, and other telehealth operations and applications, and the Internet of Things with billions upon billions of devices conveying information through the Internet. While we do not fully know all of the innovative applications that are on the horizon, it is possible to conclude that a huge amount of data, including very sensitive information, will be traveling through these networks. Therefore, they must be as secure as possible, knowing that absolute security is unachievable, and we must ensure that those with nefarious intentions cannot get access to these systems or the information they carry to do us harm in our nation. I have spoken on many occasions about the threats to our networks by these countries and their associated businesses that do not share our market-based system or support our values and freedoms. We see time and time again efforts by those entities to attempt to monopolize and gain unfair advantages in the marketplace. Further, I agree that the hard-earned dollars that the American people should not be used to buy equipment and support entities that may do us harm. For a multitude of reasons, I support today's item, and I thank Chairman Pai for bringing it forward. But I do have a few reservations. Let me caution the critics. Raising concerns on certain portions doesn't make me a sympathizer with those seeking to do harm to the United States. I'm just trying to enact sound policy and prevent potential abuses down the road. Being skeptical of and trying to protect from an authoritative government is the very nature of being an American. First, I understand the gravity of the decision to exclude certain companies from the U.S. marketplace. These designated companies stand to lose significant business opportunities. Of course, I'm not concerned about their financial opportunities lost by companies that want to do us harm, but sometimes innocent companies can be implicated by mistake. We must get these decisions right and have a process to challenge if the Bureau, which I'm not all that comfortable delegating to, gets them wrong. I appreciate the Chairman accommodating my concerns by implementing a 120-day timeline to expedite appeals of Bureau-level decisions to the Commission. This will ensure that affected parties have some timely recourse if absolutely necessary. Second, I fear we are underestimating the costs of our actions today. I was one of the first to suggest that our actions to ban certain equipment would have costs to be paid by someone, and I was criticized for doing so. Now it's universally accepted. On this point, while I appreciate that the Chairman's office and staff clarified how and when USF funds can be used and when a network contains covered equipment, our decision to prohibit the USF funds to maintain, modify, or support covered equipment in any way may result in some providers having to replace equipment earlier than scheduled when minor changes or repairs are needed to be made. Not to mention that our communication providers will have fewer equipment options which could raise costs and delay new and expanded offerings. Unfortunately, these costs will most likely affect smaller providers, which are more likely to have covered equipment and may be relying on USF dollars to remain viable. More generally, I remain disappointed in our cost-benefit analysis. Third, I am concerned we are broadly and unnecessarily interpreting some statutory provisions to justify our authority to decide that some companies should not be able to participate in the communications economy. While I'm a fervent supporter of protecting our national security, these and similar arguments are likely to be used in the future to justify mandates in the name of national security or otherwise. It is important to note that the Commission doesn't retain significant authority or much at all to affirmatively act on network security issues. That means we cannot prescribe, transcribe requirements, mandates, or other burdens on providers in the name of network security. The national security language of the statute is not a catch-all. Otherwise, it can be abused in many harmful ways. However, we do have and rightfully maintain authorization authority where we take into account Team Telecom views and condition USF in various ways to meet our policy objectives. Regardless of these concerns about the item, I remain seriously concerned about the risks that our nation's communication networks face. I appreciate the Chairman's effort and thank him tremendously and the Commission staff for tackling a very complex and challenging issue. I will vote to approve. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of visiting Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls, Montana. I spent time there with Colonel Jennifer Reeves, who's commander of the 341st Missile Wing. Colonel Reeves and her team have one of the most significant and weighty missions in government. In their charge are 150 intercontinental ballistic missiles loaded in underground silos spread out across northern Montana. These are missiles that, when launched, can carry nuclear warheads almost 10,000 miles. Colonel Reeves told me that her job is to make sure that those are always ready to go. Set against that destructive power is a completely serene and wide open landscape. It's just wheat fields and big sky country. Except, as it turns out, there are cell towers all around the Montana missile fields, running on Huawei equipment. I got a firsthand look at those and their capabilities when I was up there. This is not just a concern for the military. Everything we do in modern society now runs on interconnected networks, from banking to transportation and even our power grids. This will become only more so as carriers continue to build out 5G networks. If these networks are threatened, everything we've come to rely on is threatened. We've acknowledged the threat that Chinese telco firms pose to our networks for some time. In 2012, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence issued a report recommending that companies avoid using Huawei and ZTE equipment and that government agencies remain vigilant and focused on the threat. Last year, the National Defense Authorization Act prohibited government agencies and contractors from using Chinese equipment. The Department of Commerce has clamped down on Chinese firms' ability to do business with U.S. firms. And just this month, Attorney General Barr wrote to us at the FCC saying we should not signal that Huawei and ZTE are anything other than a threat to our collective security. Last year, we launched this proceeding to do our part to ensure U.S. national security. When combined with the ever-increasing sophistication of cyber attacks and the fact that attacks from state actors are by far the most well-funded and advanced, it's not hard to see the threat that these companies like Huawei and ZTE pose to our networks and to our national security. Indeed, China's national intelligence law requires that all organizations cooperate with the state intelligence network, and it provides them no right to refuse. It also gives the Chinese government the power to take over a company's communications equipment. And because the networks in the U.S., from rural America to big city, are interconnected, even a small amount of compromised equipment could be devastating to U.S. security. At the FCC, we're in a position to do something about this threat, and we are. Today, we're prohibiting carriers from using federal dollars to purchase any equipment or services from companies that pose a national security threat, including Huawei and ZTE. And we're not stopping there. In 2018, I called on the FCC to expand our proceeding and put even more options on the table, including the removal of covered equipment that carriers have already installed in their networks. That would include some of the equipment I saw out in Montana. After all, if equipment poses a threat, it's not enough to stop subsidizing it. It must come out of the network. Commissioner Starks is now a leading voice in this effort with his work to find it, fix it, and fund it. I'm glad for his leadership, and I'm glad we're moving forward with those ideas and proposing to take action today. I also want to thank my colleagues for agreeing to expand the scope of today's further notice. We now go beyond the initial proposal, which focused on removing equipment from networks that are supported by federal dollars, to now asking whether we should mandate the removal of all covered equipment, regardless of whether the communications provider receives federal support. I appreciate that my colleagues not only supported that suggestion, but called for similar edits in their own rights. Today, the U.S. has the leading 5G networks in the world. And our decision here will help extend American leadership by ensuring the security of these vital communications networks. So I want to thank the staff of the Wireline Bureau for their work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Great minds think alike, because I, too, am going to start with central Montana. It's a place I've spent a lot of time. And so I can say from experience that it's vast, and the plains there extend as far as the eye can see, because, of course, it's big sky country. And as you just heard my colleague mentioned, it's a place where there is an Air Force base. And it's the home of the 341st Missile Wing of the Air Force Global Strike Command. And it's an example I think both of us have seized on because it demonstrates with extraordinary clarity what having insecure networks means for our nation, especially in rural America. Because on the outskirts of this Air Force base, you will find silos with more than 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles. As press reports have suggested, they stand at the ready, buried deep underground. And those rockets can deliver nuclear warheads across the ocean thousands of miles away. They're an important part of United States Strategic Command. Now, next to those, as you heard, is something that's a lot more familiar to the people in this building and in these halls, because there are clusters of cell phone towers that are operated by a small rural wireless carrier. You might not know it when you look at them, but these towers represent a bigger risk to our national security than the missiles they surround. That's because the communications equipment that hangs on these towers is from Huawei, and we have good reason to believe that it is susceptible to undue foreign influence and control. So here's the thing. We have long known the risks of deployments that feature equipment developed by vendors like Huawei and ZTE. In fact, the federal government and our foreign nationwide carriers have shunned this technology because of its security vulnerabilities. But a small number of wireless carriers serving in remote areas like rural Montana have not. After all, Chinese-developed equipment is less costly to deploy, and the economics of serving less populated rural economies is hard. So in some cases, these insecure networks offer the only option for commercial wireless service in and around sensitive United States military bases in rural parts of the country. But it gets worse. This insecure equipment has been subsidized by the United States government and this very agency. It was purchased with money from the Universal Service Fund at the FCC. If a foreign government ever chose to exploit the radio transmitters that have been placed alongside key military installations, it could suck up sensitive data, shut down service, or launch denial of service attacks. And it gets still worse because as we transition to next generation 5G networks, insecure equipment in the telecommunications supply chain could take cybersecurity risks to entirely new levels. That's because 5G networks will allow us to move and access vastly higher quantities of data, and we will depend on them more than our prior technologies for a full range of mission-critical applications. So that's just one military base out west, and there are so many others like it all across the country. Just as there are all kinds of essential infrastructure across our rural communities that in too many cases are nestled nearby wireless networks with insecure foreign equipment. We need to do something about it. That's why 18 months ago, we started a rulemaking at the FCC aimed at fixing this problem. And today, we take a long overdue first step to do just that. I have only one complaint with this effort, that it took us so long to get here. This is not hard. It should not have taken us 18 months to reach the conclusion that federal funds should not be used to purchase equipment that undermines national security. I support this effort, and I also appreciate that my colleagues were willing to consider changes I offered to this decision and rulemaking we adopt today. In critical part, those include exploring our authority over carriers under the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act to expand our prohibition beyond just the Universal Service Program, providing additional guidance to companies so that our rules do not needlessly disrupt day-to-day service and operations in rural America, implementing the lessons learned from the 600 megahertz band incentive auction in order to maximize funds that may be available for replacing insecure equipment, and seeking to accelerate the FCC's review of a reimbursement program, an issue that has been helped along by the work of my colleague, Commissioner Starks. So while I approve today's decision and rulemaking, I think the FCC has more work to do when it comes to network security, because our present efforts to remove and replace insecure equipment are not enough. We need a coordinated national plan for managing the future of 5G security. And the evidence all around us makes crystal clear we don't have one right now. When the United States government pursues action against Huawei or ZTE, its objective should be security. But in Washington right now, I fear these issues can get easily swept up into broader trade matters. Despite our actions today, we have to grapple with the fact that at any moment, the administration could trade away our security objectives for some momentary advantage in bilateral trade negotiations. I hope that does not occur. But let's be honest. It has happened before when this administration reversed course on banning ZTE from doing business in the United States. If it happens again, it will have serious consequences for our credibility. There is also a conspicuous lack of progress in other parts of the government tasked with addressing this set of problems. New supply chain rules at the Department of Commerce that were due last month have reportedly been derailed by interagency disputes. The Bureau of Industry and Security has extended 3 times, as recently as just this week, the general license authority for United States companies to continue to work with the very companies the FCC today is trying to exclude from our networks. On top of this, the national spectrum policy that was announced in last year's executive order has fallen by the wayside. It was due in July, but is nowhere to be found. And the administration's tariffs are making it harder for the United States companies that want to invest because they're adding up to a 25% fee on modems, antennas, and semiconductors. All of this drives up the cost of 5G deployment. And just yesterday, we were told by the President that don't worry, he's asked Tim Cook to deploy 5G. Who will tell him it does not work that way? This does not inspire confidence. It's not a national plan for action. It's the right hand not talking to the left with consequences that are broader than Washington. They go directly to the heart of our competitiveness in the global economy. Nor has this gone unnoticed. Last week, the Wall Street Journal documented all the ways the federal government is tripping over itself in its efforts to support the rollout of 5G. This week, the bipartisan leadership of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, Foreign Relations Committee, and the Armed Services Committee wrote the White House expressing concern that we do not have a national coordinated strategy in place for 5G. And we need one. I agree. Looking ahead, I have some ideas about just what a national strategy could include. So here are 3 to start. First, we need an approach to supply chain security that recognizes that despite our best efforts to secure networks in the United States, they'll only go so far because no network stands alone. Our networks will still connect to insecure equipment abroad, so we need to begin researching how we can build networks that can withstand connection to equipment vulnerabilities around the world. And one way to do this is to virtualize and diversify key parts of our networks. So I put forward an idea at Mobile World Congress last month to start this conversation. I suggested the FCC work on opportunities to support improved security through open radio access networks, or Open RAN. The RAN sits between your device and the core of the carrier network. It is the most expensive and restrictive part of the network today. All major components of a RAN have to come from the same vendor. Right now, there's no way to mix and match. But if we can unlock the RAN by virtualizing this component of the network with software and off-the-shelf hardware, we will increase network diversity and improve security at lower cost. Now, I offered this idea again when I testified a few weeks ago before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. It garnered support from witnesses from the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, and the Department of State. And you know, that doesn't always happen in Washington, so we should take advantage of it. Here's what we should do next. The FCC should explore policies to support Open RAN and develop test beds that bring together stakeholders to help promote more open and interoperable standards. We can even build this effort into our ongoing work to authorize citywide 5G test beds, which we have right now in New York and Salt Lake City. Second, we are going to have to transform the Internet of Things into the Internet of Secure Things. With 5G, we are moving to a world with billions of connected devices all around us. But as these connected devices multiply, so do our security vulnerabilities. We need to adjust our policies now because the equipment that connects to our networks is just as consequential for security as the equipment that goes into our networks. And while we may be able to rip and replace the insecure equipment in networks, as we discussed today, it would be totally impractical to think we can do the same for those billions of consumer and industrial Internet of Things devices. So here's what we can do. Every device that emits radio frequency at some point passes through the FCC. And if you want proof, just pull out your smartphone or take a look at the back of any computer or television. You'll see an identification number from the FCC. It's a stamp of approval. It means the device complies with FCC rules and policy objectives before it is marketed or imported into the United States. And that routine authorization process takes place behind the scenes. But the FCC has to revisit it and explore how it can be used to encourage device manufacturers to build security into new products. And to do this, we could build on the work of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has a draft set of recommendations for security for the Internet of Things. It covers everything from device identification to device configuration to data protection to access to interfaces to critical software updates. In other words, it's the right place to start. And with billions of new devices in the Internet of Things coming our way fast, we need to get started now. Third and finally, we need smarter spectrum policy. To date, the FCC has focused its early efforts to support 5G wireless service by bringing only high-band spectrum to market. This is a mistake. The rest of the world does not have this singular focus on high-band millimeter airwaves, and with good reason. These airwaves have substantial capacity, but their signals do not travel far, and they are easily blocked by walls. As a result, commercializing them is costly, especially in rural America. The sheer volume of antenna facilities required to make this service viable will limit deployment for 5G only to our most populated urban areas. That means this agency's 5G efforts so far are only going to deepen the digital divide that already plagues too many communities nationwide. Moreover, our failure to act early on bringing mid-band spectrum to market has security consequences too. In many mid-band airwaves worldwide, there's only one Chinese vendor offering equipment. That means countries building their 5G networks using this spectrum don't have a choice when it comes to deployment. In the United States, we have unique skill and scale. That means when deployment takes place here, vendors follow. So it's time for us to make it a priority to make mid-band spectrum available too. There is no reason why our next spectrum auction should involve millimeter wave airwaves. Instead, we should be clearing the way for the 3.5 gigahertz band first and following with a C-band auction thereafter. And when we expand the market for secure equipment at home, it will have a benefit because it will also grow abroad. That's exactly what we need if we want to encourage diversity in Open RAN architectures too. Best of all, it will mean we can extend the promise of 5G wireless service to everyone, everywhere across the country. Because in the end, I think that's truly the goal for all of us. We want urban America, rural America, and everything in between to know the opportunities of next-generation wireless service. But as today's decision and rulemaking makes clear, it is not enough just to have access, because that access also has to be secure. So if we have vulnerabilities on our networks, we need to fix them. If there are rural areas adjacent to sensitive military installations in Montana or anywhere else, we're going to need to replace them. But above all, we have to get started, because this effort represents just that. It has my support. So thank you to the bureaus that worked on it, the people at the table, and Chris Monteith, the only woman at the table. It's something I know a little bit about.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Network security is national security. And as we move into a 5G world where billions of IoT devices will operate our critical infrastructure, healthcare system, financial sector, and transportation systems via mobile wireless transmissions, secure networks are not only necessary to preserve the confidentiality and integrity of our communications, but also to protect our public safety. Today, we take an important step towards protecting these networks by prohibiting the use of universal service funds for the purchase of equipment from Chinese telecommunications equipments, Huawei and ZTE. While many talk of security issues surrounding backdoors, I have said many times that untrustworthy equipment from these companies could readily serve as a front door for Chinese intelligence gathering at the expense of our privacy and our national security. I fully support our effort today to ban future purchases of such equipment using universal service funds. And while that's necessary, it's not sufficient in addressing this issue of national security. And so back in May, I published an op-ed first raising my concerns that we cannot afford to think of this issue asymmetrically. That is, focusing strictly on prohibiting untrustworthy equipment from entering our networks and not failing to account for the reality that we already have this same equipment in our infrastructure, lots of it. And so I've consistently said that this problem is real, it is already here, and our failure to address existing untrustworthy equipment leaves American citizens vulnerable to data siphoning and foreign interference. And that's why I am so glad that we are issuing a further notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on the problem of such equipment and how to address it. And as I said back in May and have said repeatedly, we need to find untrustworthy equipment, fix the problem, and fund the remedial effort. Find it, fix it, fund it. As today's item discusses, although the data collection we authorize today should provide much more information, our record in this proceeding to date suggests that much of the Huawei and ZTE equipment in our networks is held by small rural wireless carriers. And since I have first spoken out on this issue, I've traveled the country and personally met with over 24 of these carriers and their representatives. I held a workshop at the Commission earlier this year where I heard specifically from rural carriers, equipment manufacturers, national security experts, academics, and other stakeholders. And a few weeks ago, I met with the Department of Homeland Security and the Chamber of Commerce in Denver to discuss these issues with small rural carriers as well. And just yesterday, I published my white paper summarizing the facts, feedback, and recommendations that have come from those meetings. I commend it to your attention. Here's what I've learned. These carriers are made up of hardworking men and women that serve hard-to-reach communities that the major carriers can't or won't serve, operating with small teams and tight budgets, and they're worried. They're concerned that they'll be punished for using Chinese equipment in their networks that they bought lawfully and in good faith, in many cases before the full strength of our concerns about network vulnerabilities linked to Chinese telecoms manufacturers fully surfaced. And they understand that the significant security risks are associated with them having Chinese equipment in their network, and they understand how manufacturers are obligated under Chinese law to cooperate with the government's demands for network access. They understand how their vulnerable equipment could be used for surveillance, disruption of critical services, or cyber attacks, and they want to fix it, and they need our help. And this FNPRM is the first step on the long road to doing so. But such assistance shouldn't come without considering how we got into this situation and how to avoid duplicating it in the future. And based on information available today, the item indicates that replacing untrustworthy equipment in our networks could cost as much as $2 billion, and the actual figure could be more. We cannot afford to do this again. And so that's why I propose the addition of additional questions seeking comment on what factors led to the dependence of certain carriers on untrustworthy equipment and what measures the Commission could and should do to make sure that telecommunication carriers obtain and rely on equipment only from trusted vendors. And I'm particularly interested in hearing about American-made alternatives, both hardware and software-based, to help us make sure that we only have trustworthy equipment going forward. And as our world becomes even more interconnected, the FCC has a critical role to play in protecting that security. The Commission must be proactive, not reactive, in our national security measures in order to avoid problems like untrustworthy equipment in our networks going forward. And though we've done much, much more remains to be done. And here and going forward are a few leading issues that you are going to hear from me. First, I believe we need to create an FCC National Security Task Force. The Commission currently reviews national security issues on a distributed basis among various bureaus. For example, the International Bureau refers to applications to Section 214 and their licenses involving foreign ownership to Team Telecom for national security review. The Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau participates in the National Security Council's NSPM-4 process. And the Wireline and Wireless Telecommunications Bureaus consider national security and license transfers and number portability matters. And it remains to be seen, of course, which bureau will administer the tremendous task that we voted on here today in setting policy to handle untrustworthy foreign equipment. This distributed structure here at the FCC makes internal coordination challenging and risks inconsistent treatment of national security issues between the different bureaus. These issues are not going to diminish. Quite the opposite, in fact, as I expect that the Commission will continue to see an increase in the number and complexity of issues that will touch on national security. Security issues surrounding Team Telecom, CFIUS, 214 licensing, numbering, and so forth are becoming more common. We must be more intentional than ever to ensure that the whole of the FCC is more coordinated, more deliberative, and more collaborative. The FCC should issue a public notice creating the National Security Task Force like other task forces previously established in the past. I do look forward to talking about this with my colleagues. Second, as I recently wrote in the San Jose Mercury News, we must seize on this opportunity to encourage growth of American technology for next-generation networks. We cannot entrust the technological solutions of 5G to our geopolitical rivals. Rather, we must support American innovation to meet these challenges. American ingenuity has historically dominated the research, development, and deployment of telecom technology. This must continue for 5G. And American companies are already developing alternatives to traditional telecom equipment infrastructure through software-enabled, virtualized radio access networks for cloud-based 5G. And 5G infrastructure development must represent the next frontier of technological leadership. American 5G equipment will be safer because we can be confident about it and that it will observe best practices and protect our intellectual property and privacy from foreign actors. And more importantly, American companies do not answer to the directives of adversary states with no clear rule of law. Moreover, while artificially low prices may have provided a temporary advantage to Huawei and ZTE, I believe the telecom industry has come to realize that the cost and inconvenience of fixing and replacing untrustworthy equipment far outweighs these short-term savings. I believe America can and will rise to this challenge and ultimately come out of this situation more advanced, more secure, and more prosperous. Third, our network security depends on equipment that carries our communications traffic, and critically, in some instances, also on traffic that leaves our domestic networks. Like many countries around the world, the United States relies on submarine cables to carry its traffic across oceans. Pending before the Commission right now is an undersea cable application from U.S. companies that have partnered with Dr. Pang Telecom and Media Company, one of the largest telecom conglomerates in China, for cable running between Los Angeles and Hong Kong. This project is designed to carry large portions of communications between the United States and Asia, and a recent Wall Street Journal article report indicated that the Justice Department has expressed concerns that the communications could be stolen, blocked, modified on the Hong Kong end. I share these concerns as an initial matter and want to learn more about the measures that we can take and what can be done, if any, to prevent Chinese government from eavesdropping, blocking, or tampering with these communications. Finally, the nation's first primaries will take place in just a few short months. With that in mind, I have been focused on the security of our election system. The threat is real. Our intelligence agencies have confirmed that foreign actors sought to tamper with our elections in 2016 and predict that they will try to do so again in 2020. And while much of the media attention has centered on the use of social media to confuse and polarize Americans, our networks are also under attack. According to intelligence agencies, Russian-affiliated cyber actors have targeted all 50 states and their election systems during that 2016 voting cycle, including attacks on voting-related websites and voter registration databases. Although they weren't able to change individual votes or vote totals, we should expect another round of attempts in 2020. That's one reason why our network security here is critically important. While completely disconnected voting machines are the most secure, research does show that some states still use the same networks that transmit their voting results that we use for our mobile phones. And indeed, the Federal Election Commission estimates that more than 1,000 of these machines remain in use in states such as Wisconsin and Florida. Once a device is connected to a wireless network, it is subject to the same threats as other wireless communications. Voting results can be blocked or altered by criminals or adversary states using IMSI catchers or by hacking untrustworthy and insecure routers. Because of these risks, I have reached out to the major wireless carriers to discuss how they are helping to protect our networks and our security going forward and working with election officials. The FCC has a statutory obligation, in my mind, to protect the national defense, and the security of our elections qualifies to me. Moving forward, the Commission's policies must reflect this new telecom landscape. The recent influx of new unfamiliar actors in the telecom space has rendered the old systems of our operations built upon trust and familiarity quite quaint. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that I keep Americans secure, safe, and in the future. Thank you to my colleagues for all of their support for some of the edits that I made to this item, and thank you, of course, to the folks here that have worked quite hard on what is a tremendous amount of work and a very good item. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Starks. Last year, testifying before Congress, FBI Director Chris Wray said, and I quote, "We are deeply concerned about the risks of allowing any company or entity that is beholden to foreign governments that don't share our values to gain positions of power inside our telecommunications networks that provides the capacity to exert pressure or control over our telecommunications infrastructure." And last week, Attorney General Bill Barr wrote to us, "We are at a critical moment of technological change. Telecommunications providers in America and around the world are deciding who should build and service the fifth generation of wireless networks. We will become even more dependent on those networks as more and more devices and services are connected and operate at unprecedented speeds. Human life and safety, as well as critical government functions, will ride on them. Our national defense will depend on the security of our allies' networks, as well as our own. Protecting our networks, rural and urban alike, from equipment or services offered by companies posing a threat to the integrity of those networks is therefore a vital national security goal." I agree with the Attorney General of the United States and the Director of the FBI. And that is why today the FCC adopts a ban on using funds from our Universal Service Fund to purchase equipment or services from companies posing a national security threat to the integrity of communications networks or the communications supply chain. We also initially designate two Chinese companies, Huawei and ZTE, as covered companies for purposes of this rule. And we set up a process for designating additional such companies in the future. We take these actions based on evidence in the record, as well as longstanding concerns from the executive and legislative branches about the national security threats posed by certain foreign communications equipment manufacturers, most particularly Huawei and ZTE. Both companies have close ties to China's communist government and military apparatus. Both companies are subject to Chinese laws broadly obligating them to cooperate with any request from the country's intelligence services and to keep those requests secret. Both companies have engaged in conduct like intellectual property theft, bribery, and corruption. Moreover, we know that hidden backdoors to our networks and routers and switches and other network equipment can allow a hostile adversary to inject viruses and other malware, steal Americans' private data, spy on U.S. companies, and more. Indeed, just last month, the European Union found 5G security risks where a hostile state actor exercises pressure over a supplier under its jurisdiction to provide access to sensitive network assets through, either purposefully or unintentionally, embedded vulnerabilities. These concerns are by no means hypothetical. This summer, for example, an independent cybersecurity firm found that over half of the Huawei firmware images they analyzed had at least one potential backdoor, and that each Huawei device they tested had an average of 102 known vulnerabilities. Similarly, in March 2019, an oversight board in the United Kingdom released a report identifying further significant technical issues in Huawei's engineering processes, leading to new risks in the UK telecommunications networks. It also said that it has not yet seen anything to give it confidence in Huawei's capacity to successfully complete the elements of its transformation program that it has proposed as a means of addressing these underlying defects. And more generally, if the Chinese government is willing to use its leverage over things like professional basketball and Taiwanese flag emojis, imagine what could happen if we allow Chinese companies' equipment into our 5G networks. It is unsurprising, then, that earlier this year, the United States and over 30 other countries embraced a risk-based framework called the Prague Proposals. Additionally, in the last 12 months, 3 of our closest allies, New Zealand, Japan, and Australia, have issued bans on Huawei equipment. Given the threats posed by Huawei and ZTE to America's security and our 5G future, this FCC will not sit idly by and hope for the best. Today, we not only ensure that the federal funds in the Universal Service Fund are not spent on equipment or services from these suppliers, but we also propose a process to remove such equipment already deployed in USF-funded networks. Specifically, we propose to require certain carriers receiving USF funds, known as eligible telecommunications carriers, to remove from their networks existing equipment from covered companies, starting with Huawei and ZTE. To mitigate the financial impact of this requirement, particularly on small, rural carriers, we propose to establish a reimbursement program to help offset the cost of transitioning to more trusted vendors. And finally, to aid the design of a removal and replacement program, we require carriers to submit information on their use of equipment from Huawei and ZTE, as well as the potential costs associated with removing and replacing that equipment. In taking these steps, we demonstrate the FCC's commitment to doing everything we can to address national security threats to our communications networks and, together with our federal partners, to secure our 5G future. I would like to thank Commissioner Starks for focusing on this issue, both in the United States and abroad. He has shown in word and deed that the national security threats to our communications networks do not know a part of an affiliation, and addressing those threats is a joint responsibility. Also, for their outstanding work on this item, I'd like to thank Callie Coker, Kate Dumichel, Justin Falb, Ellen Gardner, Aaron Garza, Trent Harkrader, Billy Layton, Chris Monteith, Ryan Palmer, Gilbert Smith, Cody Vensky, and John Visklosky of the Wireline Competition Bureau, Kenneth Baker, Aaron Boone, Garnet Hanley, Carrie Hicks, Charles Mathias, Dana Schaefer, Sean Spivey, Don Stockdale, Joel Taubenblatt, and Suzanne Tatro of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Stephen Carpenter, Michael Connolly, Lisa Folks, Jeffrey Goldthorpe, Kurian Jacobs, Deborah Jordan, Lauren Kravitz, Nikki McGinnis, Saswat Mishra, and Austin Randazzo from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Denise Koka, Kathleen Collins, Gabrielle Kim, David Kresh, Arthur Lechtman, Tom Sullivan, and Troy Tanner of the International Bureau, Rosemary Harold, Chris Killian, Shannon Lipp, and Jeremy Marcus of the Enforcement Bureau, Ira Kelts, Julie Knapp, Aspa Perodzis, and Ron Rapasi of the Office of Engineering and Technology, Melina Barzilai, Michael Carlson, Tom Johnson, Doug Klein, Rick Mallon, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson of the Office of General Counsel, Maura McGowan and Sanford Williams of the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and Eric Berger, Octavian Crare, Jim Eisner, Ken Lynch, Alec McDonald, Julia McHenry, Chuck Needy, Eric Ralph, Steve Rosenberg, Craig Straup, Emily Talaga, and Jeff Waldow of the Office of Economics and Analytics. I hope you'll indulge my listing all of those folks, but I want the American people to know that there are very dedicated, expert public servants who have spent a lot of time here at the FCC ensuring that the networks today and the years to come are going to be secure. Your public service has my eternal gratitude. With that, we will call a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thank you for the excellent work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 2 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau and is entitled Wireless E911 Location Accuracy Requirements. Lisa Folks, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Ms. Folks, whenever you and your team are ready to go, the floor is yours. Oh, actually, sorry, before we get to that. Before we turn to Chief Folks, we are honored to have a guest speaker at the dais, Mr. Harold Schaitberger, who's the General President of the International Association of Firefighters. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, and we look forward to hearing your remarks on this important issue. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of the Commission for this opportunity to speak before you today. As mentioned, my name is Harold Schaitberger, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the General President of the International Association of Firefighters. Prior to my service to the IFF, I served as a professional firefighter in Fairfax County, Virginia, and can speak firsthand to the difficulties of operating in multi-story buildings. The IFF, representing over 320,000 professional firefighters and emergency medical personnel throughout the nation, is proud to provide our support for the wireless 911 location accuracy requirements as printed in the Commission's 5th report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking. The challenges associated with locating wireless callers in multi-story urban environments are significant. Cost firefighters precious seconds when responding, and to be blunt, cost lives. Take this building, for example. We're in a building with 10 stories, some of which are underground levels. Let's say that I were to call 911 right now and was able to provide my location and was unable to provide my location in the building. Firefighters would need to conduct a floor-to-floor search to find me. We're lucky that we're currently on the ground floor, but what if, in fact, we were on the 8th floor? In practical terms, that search could take 15 to 20 minutes. If a caller were incapacitated by smoke from a fire, having a stroke, this delay could be even longer and likely and possibly fatal. And as a real-world example, let me just give an example across the river, just miles away at Great Falls, Virginia. Firefighters regularly respond on a nearly weekly basis to citizens in need of assistance there. Great Falls, for those unfamiliar, is home to the beautiful hiking trails along the Potomac River and has significant challenges in elevation along its many cliffs and trails. These citizens in need are often lost, fall, injured. They are frequently upset, and there may be a language barrier. The bottom line is firefighters have no way of knowing their elevation, and it takes them on average 30 minutes to find these callers. Consider for a moment if you had to wait 30 minutes for firefighters to find you in an emergency. That's why we need 3-meter vertical location information. Firefighters would reduce their response time significantly. And we know this from actual field tests conducted in high-rise buildings in San Francisco, which demonstrated markedly improved response times using vertical location technology. Adopting a 3-meter metric here today will provide a real substantial improvement in search effectiveness in multi-story structures, even without a precise floor number. The Commission's proposal will also help protect firefighters as they conduct dangerous search and rescue operations. The same technology that allows public safety answering points to identify the vertical location of a caller in distress will also help locate downed rescuers. Effectively protecting the public we need to also protect the firefighters and emergency medical responders with a duty to respond. In both cases, reliable and accurate vertical information is necessary to locate citizens in distress and ensure the safety of those dispatched to aid them. Firefighters feel strongly that the FCC's proposal to adopt a 3-meter vertical location metric is timely and necessary. In an emergency, firefighters and emergency medical responders rely on information reported from 911 dispatchers to accurately locate those seeking help. And we are most effective when we can rapidly locate a 911 caller. While firefighters would find it helpful to have a specific floor and room information for a wireless call in every circumstance, such capabilities do not currently exist. We cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This proposal is good and will allow us to save many lives. Adoption of the proposal today before you will allow firefighters in major cities and beyond to benefit from vertical location information within 2 years. The tangible impact this would have on life-saving response times for individuals in distress will be enormous. Let's not miss this opportunity, and I urge the Commission to adopt a 3-meter vertical accuracy metric here today. 3 meters is achievable now, can easily be implemented, will significantly speed up response, and most importantly, will save lives. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, General President Schaeferger, for those comments, and I also want to recognize your brothers and sisters in the public safety community who are joining us here today. Thank you for being here for our consideration of this issue. We'll now turn to the Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Ms. Lisa Folks.
Good morning and happy Friday, Chairman Pye and Commissioners. When you call 911 for emergency assistance, minutes, even seconds count. The sooner first responders reach you, the sooner they can provide help. It is critical, therefore, that 911 calls are delivered with accurate information on the caller's location. But locating a 911 caller from a multi-story building presents a unique challenge for first responders. And that is why today's item is so important for the safety of all Americans. Today, we build on our efforts to help first responders more quickly and accurately locate people who call 911 from multi-story buildings. When you make a wireless 911 call from a multi-story building, like many apartments and offices, first responders may have enough information to know which structure you're in, that is your horizontal location. But they may not have actionable information to determine which floor you are on or your vertical location until today. The 5th report and order before you would establish a vertical location accuracy metric of plus or minus 3 meters to help first responders more accurately identify the floor level for most wireless 911 calls. If adopted, today's order would keep deployment of 911 vertical location technologies on schedule to meet the Commission's 2021 and 2023 deadlines in our existing 911 location accuracy rules. Most significantly, today's order would help reduce emergency response times and ultimately save lives. In addition, given that vertical location technology is improving rapidly, we also present a 5th further notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on a long-term timeline for achieving even more precise vertical location accuracy. With me at the table from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau are David Firth, Deputy Bureau Chief, John Evanoff, Deputy Chief of the Policy and Licensing Division, Alex Espinoza, an attorney advisor in the division, and Nellie Fusner, also an attorney advisor in the division. I would like to thank other Bureau staff for their hard work on this item, as well as the other bureaus and offices that contributed. Now to Ms. Fusner.
Thank you, Chief Folks. Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Today's draft report and order sets a 3-meter vertical or Z-axis location accuracy metric for wireless 911 calls. Specifically, if the order is adopted, wireless providers will be required to transmit the caller's location within 3 meters above or below the handset for 80% of indoor wireless 911 calls. As Chief Folks noted, this metric will help first responders determine the floor level of most wireless 911 calls. The draft order establishes a metric that is technology neutral and applies to all handsets that have the capability to support vertical location. Compliance with the metric will be verified by testing Z-axis technologies and the independently administered testbed that has previously been used to validate location technologies. Wireless providers will also be required to certify that their use of validated technologies is consistent with the manner in which these technologies have been tested. The draft order retains the previously adopted April 2021 and April 2023 deadlines for deployment of such technologies. The draft order requires wireless providers to report Z-axis information to 911 call centers based on height above ellipsoid, or HAE, a globally recognized standard for measuring vertical information. In addition, when floor-level information is available to wireless providers, the provider must report it to the 911 call center in addition to Z-axis information. In both cases, wireless providers must include confidence and uncertainty data so that the 911 call center can assess the reliability of the location information provided with the call. The order also adopts privacy protections for vertical location information used for 911 calls, making explicit that wireless providers and the vendors upon which they rely for Z-axis information may only use such information for 911 purposes, except with prior consent or as required by law. Recognizing that vertical location technology is likely to improve over time, the draft further notice of proposed rulemaking seeks comment on establishing a longer-term timeline for migrating to a Z-axis metric more stringent than 3 meters, and ultimately whether to require providers to deliver floor-level information with indoor wireless 911 calls. In addition, the further notice proposes to expand on the current options for demonstrating deployment of Z-axis solutions and seeks comment on additional options for delivering dispatchable location information. Finally, the further notice seeks comment on the costs and benefits associated with these proposals. The Bureau recommends adoption of this 5th report and order and 5th further notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thanks to each of you for your presentations. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No statement from me. I thank everyone working on this item, and I will support it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Fairfax Center Fire Station 40 is a showcase firehouse for the county in suburban Virginia, and I believe it probably covers some of your old stomping ground, General President Shapeberger. The immaculately maintained facilities house Fairfax's primary hazmat response team and a continuing education center for first responders. Equally celebrated is the firehouse's 100-gallon fish tank, which a shift built using spare parts and pieces ordered online. The fish tank is more than a decoration. As one firefighter told me, it's a way that she and her teammates decompress, a way to relieve the stress that comes from being depended on to save lives. I spent a morning last week with about a dozen firefighters at Station 40 to understand how location technology assists them in their job. It was an eye-opening experience. A firefighter who's been at it for decades described what it's like to charge into a burning building. It's chaos, fire and smoke, adrenaline racing. Sometimes you can't tell what floor you're on. Other times it's no use telling because floors have collapsed. 2 use cases for height sensors immediately came to the veteran firefighters' minds. He said that knowing the vertical location of a 911 caller could cut valuable search and rescue time, as we heard today. And knowing the height of a lost or unresponsive teammate could save a first responder's life, a point that all of the firefighters at the station emphasized and weighed in on. What first responders want is actionable information. Sometimes they want to know what door to kick in or what floor to climb to. And so today we require that floor-level information be provided when it's available. We seek to know the state of the science so that as technology can more regularly and accurately identify floors or even units, we can send that data to those trying to save lives. At other times, though, floor information is not what's needed. The floor from which the 911 call came won't matter if the floor has collapsed. A floor estimate is irrelevant, as we heard, to rescuing someone stuck on a cliff, an example with which the Fairfax firefighters have firsthand experience in Great Falls. And in the heat of the moment, rushing into a burning building surrounded by smoke, it's easy for a first responder to become disoriented and lose track of exactly what floor she's on. Telling her to go to floor 9 is less actionable in those cases than telling her that the 911 call originated 20 meters above her current location. And that's information that no PSAP needs to translate or convert before providing it to their fellow first responders. The true height, or HAE, approach we adopt has promise and is technically feasible today. But I think we all agree that we shouldn't put all our chips on one particular technology. That's why the further notice presses carriers, handset makers, and software companies to keep working on this data challenge so we can raise the standard as technology evolves. At the same time, we certainly shouldn't put all our chips on another technology, the makers of which say it's not ready for prime time. And that's particularly true when we can foresee that the technology won't work in so many emergency circumstances, for example, when the power is off. Everyone on this dais supports sending height information to first responders. Everyone wants to press the technologists and inventors to make that data more precise. Today's item gives us a choice. Do we send the best height information that's technically possible to first responders now? Or do we wait until better height information is available later? The companies that have been lobbying the FCC to depend on a particular technology, which, to repeat, they say isn't ready to be used, previously called on the Commission to hit the pause button on updating our vertical location requirements entirely. I, for one, don't think that we should wait. I think we should send the best information now and continue sending better information as the technology improves. And that's the same view that first responders from across the country wrote the FCC in support of. So I want to thank the overwhelming majority of the public safety community for its endorsement of the solution we reached today. I want to thank the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for its work. This item will save lives, and it's one that has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
You may make only one 911 call in your life, but the odds are it'll be the most important call you ever make. Before any police radio crackles, fire engine blares, or ambulance races, you need to reach a 911 operator. These professionals represent the front line of our nation's public safety systems. They know in emergencies every second counts. To find you, they need actionable and accurate information. I think that should be our North Star in this proceeding, making sure every 911 operator has the facts they need in a format they can use to help keep us safe. 5 years ago, after visiting 911 operators in more than a dozen call centers, I wrote an editorial calling on the FCC to improve the location information that comes with every 911 call. That's because our policies were behind the times. Our rules were a hodgepodge of standards for indoor and outdoor calling that reflected communications from a decade ago. Of course, today, over 80% of calls to 911 come from wireless phones, so I pressed this agency to kick off a proceeding to address this problem in our policies. And we got started. We set up a course to update location information for 911 calls made from wireless phones with a mix of benchmarks and deadlines. Today, the FCC tries to bring that effort to closure by adopting rules regarding vertical location data. In doing so, I'm afraid we fall short. The information we require does not go as far as we need for true public safety. We make progress, but I think ultimately we miss the mark because the information we require is simply not in a format that is presently useful for those who take our 911 calls. That's a problem. And we owe it to 911 operators and everyone who ever makes a 911 call to be honest about it. In light of this, there are three things I want to discuss regarding this order and rulemaking: the need for truly actionable location information, the need for a nationwide approach, and the need to put privacy front and center in our efforts. First, actionable location information should have been required. Today, the FCC adopts a requirement that carriers must meet if they provide vertical location information using a Z-axis solution. Specifically, the agency requires that wireless carriers offer public safety on indoor callers' vertical location within plus or minus 3 meters. The truth is, a 3-meter policy does not provide public safety with precise floor location, and that's a problem. We should choose standards that without fail provide for floor-level accuracy. When police or firefighters show up in an emergency, the last thing they should have to do is break out a measuring tape. They need a standard that tells them precisely where you are. We fall short of that with the standard we adopt today. And the result, according to those who take our 911 calls, is going to be a problem. Richard Napolitano, the commanding officer of the New York Police Department's Communications Division, which handled nearly 9 million 911 calls last year, has warned us. Location information must be actionable, meaning that police communications technicians can quickly use it to assist the caller and direct responders to the scene. For this reason, he cautioned that if you want Z-axis information to work and provide meaningful information for 911 operators, it has to be accompanied by an approximate floor number. Karima Holmes, the director of the District of Columbia Office of Unified Communications, which is responsible for 911 right here in our nation's capital, also made clear that having more specific location that can be translated in lay terms for call takers and first responders is critical for ensuring that help arrives at the right location. She asked that we develop a method to provide a floor number or wing specification. And she cautioned if we don't, and we just have something like a generic number above sea level or the like, it's not going to be actionable and it's not going to be useful. Jeff Streeter is the executive director of the Jefferson County Communications Center Authority in Denver, Colorado, and that processes over 200,000 911 calls from mobile phones each year. In our record, he put it plainly: in order for 911 professionals to have the information they need to ensure that responders arrive as quickly as possible, carriers should at least provide a floor estimate. He went on to caution that a standard of plus or minus 3 meters is not a floor estimate, and it will cause delay in emergencies when seconds matter. William Pearson, the chief of police at the Auburn Police Department in King County, Washington, which handles 450,000 911 calls a year, warned that plus or minus 3 meter standard is not a helpful description of a caller's location. According to Chief Pearson, seconds count. If first responders in the 911 center or in the field must spend any time trying to cross-reference a location, the impact is seconds or minutes lost in influencing a positive outcome for that 911 caller. Put simply, this is why having truly actionable information like a floor number is so important. I think we should listen to these voices from 911. We should listen to those charged with identifying our emergency and working to send assistance. We should provide them with truly actionable information when you dial 911. Regrettably, today the FCC does not do that. Because instead of requiring a floor number or setting up a system for useful and actionable information, we require data in height above ellipsoid format. So when calls come tumbling into 911 in a crisis, the operator on the other end of the line is supposed to figure out where you are because they have a string of numbers representing the raw height above ellipsoid data that reflects coordinates measured from the center of the Earth's mass. Got that? Let's be clear. This data is not meaningful. It will need to be calibrated, translated, and reworked to be actionable for 911. And where's the detailed plan for that? Comb through the text of today's decision. You won't find one. Remember that there are over 6,000 public safety answering points or 911 centers around the country. There are more than 100,000 911 professionals who work in them day in and day out, taking every call with steely calm. They've already been told they need to upgrade their systems to next generation 911, and that's going to cost over $12 billion. No one knows where this funding is going to come from. And yet today, we are tacking on a brand new obligation for 911 centers to take raw height above ellipsoid data and hope and pray that they will be able to translate it into something actionable. But Commanding Officer Napolitano from New York told us in no uncertain terms that a raw vertical estimate is of little operational value if it is relative to height above ellipsoid, because our 911 center does not have the equipment necessary to translate Z coordinates into anything actionable. If it does not work in New York, one of the cities where the case for vertical location is clearest, it calls into question how it will work anywhere. In fact, this is not just an issue for our biggest cities. Kimberly Burdick, who is the director of the 911 Communications Center in rural Chautau County, Montana, warns that centers like mine do not have the resources to create and maintain indoor maps for buildings in our jurisdiction, or even the ability to translate height above ellipsoid to a floor or a three-dimensional point in space. Of course, it is worth recognizing that even if 911 operators cannot translate height above ellipsoid data, they can relay it to a responding paramedic, firefighter, or police officer at the scene who may be able to take action. But the same problem emerges, because a height above ellipsoid set of numbers will be meaningless unless it is calibrated and translated into something actionable by the first responder. But again, there's no requirement here that ensures that happens. Instead, we have to hope that every first responder will be outfitted with the right technology to translate height above ellipsoid data on the fly. That's a huge assumption and a glaring hole in the policies we adopt today. Do public safety officials in every town, city, county, and state have the budget to do that? How much will it cost? Who will pay for it? Is it even possible? Does this even work, as the New York City Police Department questions, during a building fire or an active shooter situation where the last thing you want is first responders wasting precious minutes fumbling with this data on a specialized device? On all of this, our decision is silent. We should do better. Putting aside these problems with data processing, I think it's also important to peel back and take a look at the details that led the FCC to this standard. The new rules require that wireless carriers relying on Z-axis satisfy their vertical location obligation with data accurate at plus or minus 3 meters height above ellipsoid for 80% of their wireless E911 calls made from a Z-axis capable device. But this standard is entirely based on results from a test bed. And that test bed was in a controlled environment. It does not reflect widespread real-world use. That, too, is a problem with this requirement. Second, I think a nationwide approach would have been the right call. The approach we take today proceeds on a pathway we set up a few years back to require vertical location information for 911 calls made in the top 25 metropolitan areas by 2021 and the largest 50 metropolitan areas by 2023. However, it has become clear that a nationwide approach would better serve the public interest. Because by limiting our efforts here, too many people in too many places, especially in rural America, will never see the benefit of any policy designed to provide a caller's vertical location. That's a shame, because there are multi-story office parks, townhomes, and other structures across the country. I regret my colleagues did not agree to my request to be more ambitious and ensure our rules cover every call. Any policy designed to improve 911 location accuracy should benefit every 911 caller nationwide, not just those who dial from the biggest cities and most populated areas. Third, privacy is paramount. So finally, I'd like to discuss an aspect of today's decision I do support because the FCC is clearly on the right path, and that involves the privacy and data security protections extended to 911 vertical location data. The agency rightly concludes that 911 vertical location data should only be used for 911 purposes. While I would have preferred that we go one step further to require a report to see how these requirements were working in practice, I do support this aspect of today's decision. The vertical location data associated with your 911 call should be private and protected. This is especially important because this agency has been unacceptably silent about press reports about the sale of our wireless geolocation data. Last year, it was first revealed that wireless carriers were selling our private data about when and where we are using our devices to third-party location aggregators. Then earlier this year, it was revealed that this data was still for sale and ending up in the hands of bounty hunters. It turns out that for a few $100s, shady middlemen could use this information to track where we are at any moment within a few hundred meters. Now, I don't recall consenting to have my wireless location data sold this way, and yet it still happened. I just don't see how this is permissible under the law. But to date, this agency has been totally silent. It's been close to a year and a half since this mess was first uncovered, and the FCC has nothing to say. I hope that silence ends soon, because this, like 911 location data, involves the security and safety of the public. In closing, I'd like to note that even though we have some fundamental disagreements today, I really do appreciate my colleagues' history of working to improve 911 safety. From my efforts with Commissioner O'Reilly to end 911 fee diversion in the states, to Chairman Pai's well-known passion for fixing 911 problems in multi-line telephone systems, I am still optimistic about what this agency can accomplish. Kurt Vonnegut once said, "There is no better symbol of humanity than a fire truck." I believe it, and I know it up close because in my office, one of my advisors is a volunteer firefighter for the Loudoun County Fire Department. And I know from him and my own experience on this dais and in this role that in an emergency, whether you are a trained professional or a good Samaritan, there is a reflex in all of us that compels us to act, to ease suffering and save lives. That same reflex exists in those of us in Washington setting policy when we see that our public safety officials are lacking the tools they need to do their jobs. So I appreciate what is driving this agency to act. But as any trained professional will tell you, sometimes you have to look up from the immediate problem and take in the bigger picture. You have to pause and make sure the actions you are taking truly will have the impact you want them to have. So I do not support the standard we adopt today for vertical location accuracy. By any measure, it falls short of what is actionable. It does not provide floor-level information and instead just offers a series of numbers reflecting height above ellipsoid. I believe our 911 operators deserve data that is truly useful if we want to help them help keep us safe. And on that score, we have work to do. I will support the rulemaking here today because I believe it provides us with a path to fix these problems. I will also support the decisions we make regarding 911 privacy. But in all other respects, I regretfully dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A call to 911 is, of course, one that we all hope we never have to make. With today's order and the NPRM, we take the next step in deploying life-saving location technology for mobile phone users that will improve the ability of first responders to send help where it is needed. This is a step in the right direction, but it is not the final one. The 3-meter metric we adopt today will first get responders close to those in distress. But as I have noted in the past, floor-level accuracy is needed to ensure that they get to the right place every time and in time. I am pleased that this NPRM seeks comment on transitioning to that more stringent metric. This is literally a life or death issue, and we need to move fast. The increasingly accurate location data that we provide to first responders increases safety, but it also increases our responsibility to protect user privacy. This is sensitive personal information that is vulnerable to abuse outside of the 911 context. I did suggest edits to the item to foreclose the possibility that vertical location details could be abused by third-party vendors that CMRS providers work with. I appreciate that the chairman and my colleagues worked with me to close that loophole. We must also continue to work to ensure that the benefits of enhanced 911 reach all Americans, including Lifeline recipients. Through today's NPRM, we ask important questions about how to increase the stock of Lifeline phones that are Z-Access capable. I am pleased that the order adopts a technology-neutral approach to the Z-Access support, and that it appears that some providers are working towards solutions that do not require special hardware and may more readily work with Lifeline phones. Because Lifeline provides that essential connection to our most vulnerable, we must ensure that they are not left behind. As we work towards improved location accuracy for emergency response, I look forward to robust commentary on these issues. Many thanks to the staff for your hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner. When you dial 911 for help, every second counts. And that is why first responders need to be able to find you as quickly as possible. But when you call 911 from wireless phone in a multi-story building, as many Americans do every day, this can be a challenge. First responders may know what building address you're calling from, but they may find it difficult, if not impossible, to figure out what floor you're on. And so today we aim to close this gap. We do this by adopting a vertical or Z-axis location accuracy metric of plus or minus 3 meters for 80% of wireless E911 calls from Z-axis capable handsets. In English, what this means is that first responders will now be able to more accurately identify the floor level for most 911 calls and reduce emergency response time. Perhaps the best verdict on what this 3-meter metric means comes directly from the public safety community. In a recent joint statement, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the International Association of Firefighters, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, and the National Association of State EMS Officials state, and I quote, "A 3-meter Z-axis metric not only provides emergency responders with actionable location information, but it also gives the public greater assurance that when they dial 911 from their cell phones, emergency responders can find them more quickly." The National Association of EMS Physicians says that our action today will, quote, "provide faster medical attention, ideally improving outcomes and saving lives." And NINA, the 911 Association, says that, and I quote, "We are pleased with the plus or minus 3-meter standard, and we're not alone. It is safe to say that public safety stands behind the FCC's draft rules." The National Association of State 911 Administrators says, and I quote, "With these rules and proposals, the FCC demonstrates the importance of accurate wireless 911 location information and its critical role in public safety." The National Sheriff's Association says, and I quote, "This rule will enable 911 callers to be located more quickly, will greatly improve response times, and will save lives." And just yesterday, I visited the Cambridge, Massachusetts Emergency Communications Department, where I met, among others, David Harmon. This public safety hero was the police dispatcher who was on call in 2013, following the Boston Marathon bombings, when MIT officer Sean Collier was shot and killed, and the suspects raised mayhem across the Boston metropolitan area. As David put it, this Z-axis metric will make all the difference in the world. It's gigantic. I am grateful for the service of the public safety heroes who sacrifice so much every day to protect Americans. I'm honored to have their strong support of the bipartisan decision of the FCC's majority today, and I am proud to stand on the side of public safety. In adopting a Z-axis metric, we also take steps to protect data privacy and security. First, we amend our rules to ensure that Z-axis information from 911 calls is used only for 911 purposes. And we require that any Z-axis information that is stored before or after the 911 call also will be subject to the same consumer privacy and security protections that apply to data for purposes of the National Emergency Address Database. These measures are consistent with our long-standing approach to the protection of 911 location data and consumer privacy. Now, as important as today's action is, we also recognize that as technology evolves, so too should our Z-axis metric. And so we're looking at tightening the Z-axis metric over time, and even requiring wireless carriers ultimately to report the caller's specific floor level. We also seek input on alternative deployment milestones for Z-axis and dispatchable location technologies. I again would like to express my personal gratitude to Mr. Schaetberger, the General President of the International Association of Firefighters. The IAFF, for over a century, has represented the interests of firefighters and paramedics in the United States and Canada, and currently represents some 320,000 of these frontline professionals across North America. These are the men and women who rush into buildings when there's an emergency. They are the ones who best understand what information they need to find someone quickly and to help save lives. And I can't put it any better than Mr. Schaetberger did. They feel strongly that this is a timely and necessary measure that will have a real and substantial improvement and will save lives. Amen to that. We wouldn't have reached this milestone, of course, without the commitment of our own heroes in the public safety community, the staff from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Office of General Counsel, and the Office of Managing Director. Thank you so much for helping us get this across the finish line. It has my full support. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve in part, dissent in part.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted. The editorial privilege is granted as requested. Thanks to all of you for your work, and thanks again for the presentation, sir. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to item number 3 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the Office of General Counsel and is entitled Modernizing Suspension and Debarment Rules. Thomas Johnson, FCC General Counsel, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And as the Office of General Counsel is arraying itself, let the record show that despite the fact that the room is clearing, there is still one television camera ready to capture this moment of high drama at the FCC's public meeting.
The one I've been waiting for, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Office of General Counsel is pleased to present for your consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking that aims to provide the Commission with additional tools to prevent bad actors from participating in our universal service support programs. We believe that these additional tools would allow the Commission to more effectively combat the waste, fraud, and abuse of federal funds. Among other things, this item proposes that the Commission have more flexibility to work with our sister departments and agencies throughout the federal government to swiftly root out bad actors who might otherwise cheat the American taxpayer and make it more difficult for the Commission to do its important work of providing funding to rural and less prosperous areas of the country and closing the digital divide. I would like to thank my office's team for their hard work on this item, as well as numerous colleagues who provided valuable input in the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Media Bureau, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and the Office of the Inspector General. Seated with me at the table today from my office are Linda Oliver, Associate General Counsel, Chin Yu, Deputy Associate General Counsel, and Paula Silberthaw, Attorney Advisor. Paula will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Over the past several decades, the Universal Service Fund programs have offered needed support for schools and libraries, rural health care, high-cost and rural areas, and low-income consumers. Similarly, the Telecommunications Relay Service Programs, or TRS, have assisted users who would otherwise be unable to access a variety of communication services. The Commission is charged with overseeing these programs, each of which is critical to bridging the digital divide. One important aspect of the Commission's effective oversight of the programs is keeping them free of bad actors that would divert these funds from their intended important purposes. This notice proposes to adopt new rules consistent with the government-wide Office of Management and Budget Guidelines on debarment and suspension for non-procurement programs. Adoption of new rules consistent with the OMB guidelines would substantially broaden the scope and efficacy of the Commission's suspension and debarment powers and allow the Commission to take swift and effective action to prevent harm to our programs or diversion of funds. The proposed rules would apply not just to the USF programs like the current rules, but also to TRS programs and the National Deafblind Equipment Distribution Program. The proposed rules would afford the Commission far more discretion to determine what conduct merits suspension or debarment and authorize prompt action to protect the public interest. Significantly, the proposed rules would allow the Commission a much broader range of offenses as triggering suspension or debarment that are not limited to conduct in the Commission's own programs. It would also allow the Commission to take action based on conduct such as willful and repeated violation of program regulations. Adequate evidence would be required before any suspension and a preponderance of evidence before any debarment. But under the proposed rules, the Commission would no longer be required to wait for a criminal conviction or a civil judgment related to a USF program before it could prevent a bad actor from receiving program funds. Under the proposed rules, individuals who have a history of fraudulent conduct will not be able to hide behind a corporate facade or vice versa. Significantly, adoption of new rules consistent with the OMB guidelines would allow the Commission to now participate in a government-wide system with reciprocity. In that system, any person or entity suspended or debarred by one agency is placed on a government-wide exclusions list and cannot participate in any agency's program unless otherwise exempted for good cause. Before participating in a Commission program, a party would now have to disclose whether it was on the government-wide exclusion list, and, if so, it could not enter into new transactions. In addition, a suspension or debarment under the proposed rules would prevent a person from obtaining new government contracts. Thus, the government-wide application of a suspension and debarment would provide a very strong deterrent effect. At the same time, the item recognizes that Commission programs are unique, and it asks how best to tailor the OMB guidelines with FCC-specific rules. Those could include possible transitional mechanisms or exceptions to handle a potential suspension when a service provider may be the sole source for serving a specific community of users. The Office of General Counsel recommends adoption of this notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lopatha, for that presentation. Before I turn to Commissioner O'Reilly, I will note that I have had the privilege of knowing you for over a decade, both in the Office of General Counsel and the Commissioner's Office, and now in my current role as a coworker and a friend. I'm now pleased to say that you're, for the first time, a presenter at a Commission meeting. Congratulations on the milestone. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully support this proposal to streamline and strengthen our suspension and disbarment rules, generally consistent with the Office of Management and Budget Guidelines. In addition to harmonizing our rules with those of the rest of the federal government, expansion of our authority to suspend or disbar or debar offending parties through adoption of the guidelines should also help protect the integrity of the Commission's subsidy programs and ratepayers' hard-earned investments. The Commission has a fundamental duty to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse within all of our programs, and the more tools in our arsenal to do so, the better. Adoption of the OMB guidelines would enable the Commission to engage in suspension or debarment procedures more expeditiously than under our current rules. However, our mandate to act expeditiously would also work and should work both ways. And like in the supply chain item, where we included language to provide more certainty for those that are listed as designated entities, the Commission shouldn't be able to indefinitely delay responding to a party's petition for reconsideration or application for review in response to a suspension or debarment action. Otherwise, we could be creating regulatory quicksand, punishing subjected entities without proper due process. I'm therefore grateful to the chairman and his staff for adding language to the draft seeking comment on implementing a deadline by which the Commission's debarring or suspending official would be required to act. While I suspect we're going to need more certainty than make every effort as contemplated in the text, it appropriately opens a door for discussion. Such a measure is necessary as a matter of good governance and to protect parties' ability to seek judicial review. While I have full confidence in this Commission staff, such limitations are necessary to prevent a future potential questionable staff member from abusing power and leaving affected parties without viable options to move forward. I also want to thank the Chair for clarifying that serious and repeated violations of Commission rules, including our prohibitions against slamming and cramming, would fall within the ambit of the guidelines. In the past, I've spoken out in favor of the need to expand authority to combat such activities, since imposing fines is often inadequate or futile. In turn, I've also advocated for the ability to revoke a provider's Section 214 authorization in such instances, and understand that Commissioner Rosenworcel and in the past former Commissioner Clyburn have pushed for the same. While I would have preferred to include Section 214 authorizations within the scope of covered transactions in the present instance, the additional authority that the guidelines would provide to punish slamming and cramming is at least a step in the right direction. This only means that I will have to continue my push to disqualify those abusing Commission rules from our authorization process at a later time. Finally, I would highlight the need to carefully consider separation of powers principles and neutrality concerns in determining which entity should be responsible for designating suspensions or debarment. While the Enforcement Bureau currently occupies that role, it can only pursue a suspension or debarment action following a court judgment or conviction, and thus exercises its role in a non-discretionary and largely ministerial manner. Adoption of the OMB guidelines would render this role much more adjudicatory and discretionary, which would in turn raise concerns over considering the functions of designating suspensions or debarments and prosecuting or investigating the underlying conduct within the same entity. Granted, concentration of powers in the same hands is an issue that permeates all structure of federal and independent agencies, but that is, of course, a topic for another day. I will certainly vote to approve, and I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Thank you to Paula, to Tom, Linda, Chin for all of your work on this item. As we administer the roughly $10 billion in annual support from Universal Service and related support programs, we must be good stewards of those funds. As we've heard, every dollar wasted or diverted is one that can't support the important purposes that our programs serve. So I'm glad that we are strengthening and enhancing our ability to go after bad actors today, and that the item has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Year in and year out, the FCC oversees the distributions of billions, that's billions with a B, of dollars through the Universal Service Fund, Telecommunications Relay Service System, and National Deaf-Blind Equipment Distribution Program. To prevent waste, fraud, and abuse, this agency prevents those convicted or found civilly liable for misconduct relating to these programs from participation. Those rules that do so are known as suspension and debarment, and today we're revisiting those policies. Our goal is to improve them and align them with similar guidelines used by the Office of Management and Budget. I think this is a worthy effort because done right, we will have new tools to prevent problems with these programs going forward. Moreover, our suspension and debarment rules have been underutilized in recent years, and it is smart and timely to ask if there are improvements to be made. I'm also pleased that at my request, this rulemaking now also asks questions about preventing those who have been suspended or debarred from sitting on FCC advisory committees. That's not an abstract thing, because a while back, the leadership of this agency appointed members to its Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, and sitting at the top of this organization was someone named Elizabeth Pierce. Her name might sound familiar. While she was put at the helm of BDAC and entrusted with an important role at this agency, She was also engaged in serious fraud. She developed no less than 8 fraudulent contracts for telecommunications services worth over $1 billion. She no longer serves in an advisory role at the FCC. She is serving time in jail. It is a black mark on this agency that she was ever put in trust of such an important committee. And I hope with this rulemaking, we ensure that this kind of mess never happens again. This has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ensuring the integrity of our programs is one of the Commission's most important roles. This is particularly true with respect to initiatives like Lifeline, the National Deaf Blind Equipment Distribution Program, E-Rate High Cost, Rural Health Care, and TRS. These programs are critical to many Americans, and we must be a careful steward of our resources. We must also guard against those who would misuse those resources, divert limited funds from those who need the support the most. The rules proposed in this NPRM will help us quickly suspend and debar actors who willfully or repeatedly misuse our funds, and they will give us greater flexibility and speed in managing our enforcement processes. The NPRM we adopt today will begin the process of modernizing and streamlining our enforcement efforts that I was a part of for quite a good time that I was here at the FCC working with you as well, Paula, Linda, and Shin. Thank you for your work on this issue, your continued focus on this, and a very good effort here today, Mr. General Counsel. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I did have a very detailed set of questions that I wanted to engage in a colloquy with the General Counsel about, but for the first time in living memory, we have a vacuum of leadership in that slot. So I will have to, unfortunately, forego the colloquy and simply voice my support for the work that you've done on this important item. Thank you again, Paula, and to the entire team for your efforts. We'll now move to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
Chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted. The roll privilege is granted as requested. Thanks so much to OJC. Madam Secretary, we're almost halfway done. Take us to item number 4, please.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the 4th item is entitled Modernizing, Unbundling, and Resale Requirements in an Era of Next-Generation Networks and Services. The item will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. Ms. Monteith, welcome back, and look forward to hearing from you and your team.
So good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
The Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking that would, if adopted, propose to modernize decades-old unbundling and resale obligations that apply only to incumbent local exchange carriers. I would like to thank the fantastic Bureau team for their hard work on this item, as well as our colleagues in the Offices of Economics and Analytics and General Counsel for their review and helpful input. Seated at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau and the Competition Policy Division are Terry Natoli, Associate Bureau Chief, Pam Arlak, Division Chief, Ramesh Nagarajan, Deputy Division Chief, Michelle Levy-Burlove, Special Counsel, and Claudia Pebo, Legal Assistant to the Division Chief. Claudia will now present the item, and I just want to note that this is likely to be Claudia's last presentation to the Commission, as she has sadly notified us that she will be retiring in the new year. So,
I'm sorry, the Commission dissents. You're required to stay.
I think I have a strong case for retirement since I've been here for 44 years.
We'll take it under advisement.
Thank you, thank you.
Take it away, Claudia.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This notice of proposed rulemaking proposes to update the Commission's network unbundling and avoided cost resale requirements to reflect the dramatic changes that have taken place in the industry since Congress passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996 over 23 years ago. To open the then monopoly local telephone market to competitive entry, the 1996 Act required incumbent local exchange carriers to offer unbundled network elements to new entrants at cost-based rates. It also required these incumbent carriers to offer their retail telecommunications services to competitors at regulated wholesale rates for resale to the competitors' customers. The notice before you seeks to modernize the Commission's unbundling and resale requirements to reflect the transformative changes in technology and competition since 1996 through the following proposals. First, the notice proposes to eliminate unbundling obligations for DS1 and DS3 enterprise loops in areas already found competitive in the 2017 BDS order and the 2018 rate of return BDS order. For DSO mass market loops in urban areas and for narrowband voice grade loops nationwide. However, unbundling of broadband-capable mass-market loops would still be required in rural areas where there may be greater barriers to broadband deployment. Second, the notice proposes to eliminate unbundling requirements for dark fiber transport in incumbent carrier wire centers located within a half-mile of a competitive fiber network. Third, the notice proposes to forbear from avoided cost resale requirements in non-price cap incumbent carrier areas. Finally, consistent with recent Commission precedent, the notice proposes a 3-year transition period for existing customers. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pabo, for that presentation. And in all seriousness, congratulations on what I understand is your first presentation at an FCC meeting. You're ending with a bang, but I do want to recognize you for your public service, having started here at the FCC, as I understand it, on September 14th, 1975. You spent over 40 years in the WCB's Competition Policy Division, the longest-serving staffer ever in the history of that division. You've worked on a bunch of stuff from several 271 applications, some of the computer inquiry proceedings, telephone competition issues arising from the 96 Act. You've seen it all. And so while we certainly wish you well in your retirement, it is with a bunch of regret that we are saying goodbye to you and to the amazing amount of expertise and collegiality you've brought to your efforts. So thank you for your public service, including this morning on this item.
Thank you.
Commissioner O'Reilly, any comments you might have?
I want to submit my statement for the record and add my comments to the chairman's, and appreciate you for all that you've done and dedicating your life to public service. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. It's not always easy to keep up with the latest trends. And in my personal life as a dad of 3, I have long since given up on trying to keep up with those. But in my professional life here at the agency, I have no such choice. We have to keep up with both technology and market evolutions, from copper to fiber, from POTS to 5G. Today, we're taking a major step in the right direction. The Telecom Act of 1996 has in many ways been a great success. It took a monopolized industry and planted the seeds for what would become, and now is, a dynamic, competitive free market. The unbundled network elements at the heart of the 1996 reforms were a stepping stone for carriers to enter a market that previously enjoyed high and government-imposed barriers to entry. It took heavy-handed regulation to enable scrappy new entrants to compete with entrenched monopolists. We're now 20-plus years removed from those monopoly days, more than a few lifetimes in technology. And by all measures, Americans are now benefiting from world-leading investments in competing networks. The secret to the American success story in telecom has been our commitment to facilities-based competition and light-touch regulation. And for free markets to flourish, we need to let go of heavy-handed regulation when they've outlived their original purposes. Otherwise, rules designed to encourage investment and build-out will hit a tipping point and start depressing those same incentives. To that end, we've already eliminated the mandatory unbundling obligations that skewed investment and deterred build-out. We've allowed providers from previously siloed segments of the market to compete against each other: cable, telcos, wireless providers, satellite, WISPs, are now all investing in their networks to compete and win subscribers from each other. Indeed, we know that America's commitment to facilities-based competition pays off. A study comparing broadband investment in the US and Europe showed that American carriers invested twice as much per person as their European counterparts and paved the way for new forms of competition. Today, we're choosing to continue this successful light touch approach that served us so well over the years. We do so by proposing to eliminate certain unbundling obligations that may have outlived their usefulness, while recognizing that some may continue to have benefits for the public interest. So I want to thank you, the Wireline Competition Bureau, for your work on this item. Thank you, Claudia, for your service to the agency. The item before us has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Competition is at the heart of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and that's a good thing. Competition benefits our economy and helps consumers enjoy lower prices and higher rates of innovation. Now, to bring this about, the law set up a new paradigm to expand the number of carriers capable of offering communications and induce their entry into local markets. This included policies that opened elements of incumbent provider networks to competition and also made their services available on a resale basis. Now, over time, the FCC has adjusted these policies. Sometimes it has added to them, sometimes it has tweaked them, and more recently, it has granted requests to scale back these policies and reduce network access by competitors. As technology has advanced, some of these choices have been prudent, but others have hit hard and struck deep by revisiting the competitive fundamentals of the law. In today's rulemaking, the FCC proposes to do just that by bringing an end to key elements of its unbundling and resale policies. This is not a subtle exercise. While I'm open to having a discussion about the impact of these changes, I think today's effort is flawed. That's because it offers proposals to cut away at core competitive tenets of the law, and it's written in a manner suggesting the outcome is all but predetermined. To ensure this proceeding is open, honest, and fair, I recommended that instead of kicking this effort off with a rulemaking, we could start with a notice of inquiry. I also recommended that we just take out the many to tentative conclusions in this rulemaking to avoid prejudging the outcome for consumers and competition. I regret that my colleagues did not agree to those changes, so I choose to dissent and will likewise offer my dissent for the fact that Claudio Pabo will no longer be roaming these halls. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wholeheartedly agree that the market has changed in the last 20 years. But that does not mean that all of our pro-competition rules are outdated and must be abandoned. I support a cautious approach to changing our unbundling and resale rules. We should be making these decisions based on rigorous data collection, reasoned analysis, and a careful look back at the results of the Commission's recent deregulatory actions. This is an NPRM that proposes what I think are consequential changes to our communications market on the heels of what are already sweeping changes we made just a few months ago. The companies affected by the forbearance decisions we made earlier this year are still wrestling and grappling with how to move forward as competitors, and the NPRM's evidence of competition, I think, falls short in places. For example, some of the NPRM's proposals turn on the prediction that wireless 5G technology will become a substitute for fixed broadband. And while I do welcome all technological developments that would help solve what I have called internet inequality, but I note that as of now, that prediction lacks sufficient evidence, in my mind, to support the weight the NPRM puts on it. Moreover, the NPRM doubles down on our reliance on the assumptions of the Business Data Services Order, and I continue to have deep concerns with the reasoning that the presence of potential competition in an area means that the area is completely competitive. I also remain concerned about the impact this series of decisions will have on government users, as I have previously voiced, and ultimately taxpayers. The GSA has made important strides in recent years towards increasing competition for government telecommunications. contracts to promote better services and offerings and lower prices. Our August 2019 forbearance decision made it more difficult for smaller competitors to compete for those contracts, and I think today's decision compounds that. I am mindful of our statutory obligations when considering a request to remove regulations through forbearance, and I also take seriously our obligation to rigorously apply those standards in a way that promotes competition in the public interest. And at this time, I do not see an urgent need for the Commission to sua sponte propose a further rollback of the pro-competition tools from the 1996 Act that was created. We are still working to fully understand the competitive consequences of our previous forbearance orders and should propose further deregulatory action only when that information is more in hand. I respectfully dissent, and I do thank the Wireline Competition for their work, and of course, Claudia, thank you for your longtime service to this agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. 20 years ago, my predecessor, FCC Chairman Bill Kennard, spoke about striking the right balance between competition and deregulation. The obvious challenge, he observed, is finding the right balance between imposing rules to introduce competition and eliminating rules that are no longer needed because competition has taken root. Accordingly, he said that, and I quote, "As consumers enjoy more and more choice, we are lifting regulatory burdens on incumbents and making regulation give way to the marketplace." This made sense, as he saw it during the Clinton administration, because, quote, "We could create more incentives for investment in broadband if we did not require incumbent LECs to unbundle certain equipment needed to deploy advanced services." Well, today we apply these same principles as we re-examine the unbundling and resale rules stemming from the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Over the past 2 decades, the communications landscape has dramatically transformed, with both the voice and broadband marketplaces replete with competition from a multitude of providers using a variety of technologies and offering capabilities and services that were unforeseen in 1996. In light of these substantial marketplace changes, we propose to remove certain unbundling and resale obligations that unnecessarily burden incumbent carriers and reduce incentives for incumbents and competitors alike to deploy and transition to next-generation networks. At the same time, we recognize that unbundling requirements may have continued benefits in areas where facilities-based competition is less likely to occur. And so, to strike the right balance, we propose to maintain unbundling of broadband-capable loops used to serve residential customers in rural areas. We are simply, in a nutshell, bringing our unbundling and resale rules into the modern era. And so, this item has my full support, and I would like to thank the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of General Counsel for their work on the item. We'll now proceed to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approved.
Commissioner Rosenworcel? Commissioner Starks?
Dissent.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks, and we'll see you next year. Yeah. Madam Secretary, to item number 5 we go.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the 5th item on your agenda will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled All Digital AM Broadcasting, Revitalization of the AM Radio Service, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, whenever you and your folks are ready, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Media Bureau presents a notice of proposed rulemaking that proposes to allow AM stations to broadcast using an all-digital signal. Joining me at the table are Jim Bradshaw, Lisa Scanlon, and Jerry Menunchuk of the Media Bureau. Jim will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking to authorize AM broadcasters to voluntarily adopt all digital broadcasts. This proceeding arises from a petition for rulemaking filed by an AM broadcaster and has received considerable support from industry stakeholders. In 2002, the Commission first authorized AM and FM broadcasters to commence digital broadcasts using a hybrid mode that allows stations to simulcast their signal in analog and digital. Although that hybrid system works well for FM broadcasts, the nature of the AM band makes it difficult to simultaneously have a digital signal and an analog signal, and has hampered the widespread adoption of AM digital radio. Recently, broadcasters have conducted laboratory and field tests to determine whether all digital operation that eliminates the analog portion of the signal would provide a better solution for AM stations. Those tests indicate all digital broadcasts are more robust than hybrid digital signals and can provide coverage equal to or exceeding analog coverage. The AM digital system can provide stereo quality audio, better reliability, and new data services for listeners with a digital receiver. Therefore, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking proposes to allow AM broadcasters to convert to all digital transmissions on a voluntary basis. Offering this choice will allow AM broadcasters to make their own assessment of their circumstances and readiness of their respective markets to transition to all digital systems. We believe this option will be most attractive to stations that can attract new listeners with a higher quality audio and new services digital broadcasting supports. The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking seeks comment on the benefits of digital AM, the cost for stations to convert, and any potential impact from the loss of analog service. It also requests input on appropriate operating and service parameters for all digital stations, such as power limits and nighttime operation. It proposes to adopt the National Radio Systems Committee's technical standard for digital broadcasts, including hybrid operations. The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking also seeks comment on how to minimize the possibility of interference from all digital stations. Finally, it would establish a procedure for stations to notify the Commission when they convert to all digital broadcasts or if they convert back to hybrid or analog broadcasts. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt this Notice of Proposed Rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bradshaw, for your presentation. But before turning the microphone over to Commissioner O'Reilly, I want to salute you and congratulate you for winning the E. Noel Luddy Award for Meritorious Service from the Association of Federal Communications Consulting Engineers. This is frequently but always given to an FCC employee who has put in, quote, notable and exemplary service to the industry. And you've done that certainly since 1991 across the entire media landscape. So thank you for the presentation as well as the award.
Thank you very much.
And you're not leaving, correct?
Not soon.
Good, good. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All of the state broadcaster events that I've attended over the years have taught me much about the industry and the great service broadcasters provide in their local communities. The Texas Association of Broadcasters event was no different, except maybe a tad bigger. While visiting their annual trade show in Austin last year, I had the distinct honor of participating in an armchair conversation with Bryan Broadcasting Corporation's very own Ben Downs, during which we discussed many issues confronting the broadcasting industry, including AM revitalization. For anyone who knows this issue, Ben is one of the original, if not first, proponents of optional digital AM and one of its staunchest advocates. Naturally, one of the topics that came up during our discussion was this very issue, which I supported at the time. So it gives me distinct pleasure to see it brought before the Commission for consideration today. Assuming this item goes to final order, it remains to be seen whether digital AM signals will ever catch on with manufacturers and, more importantly, listeners, or serves as a significant factor in the band's revitalization. But a record clearly demonstrates that many in the industry would very much like the opportunity to at least have the chance to test this approach without having to obtain an experimental license. We need to give them that. When it comes to adopting specific technical standards, I do continue to have serious reservations regarding this approach, as the Commission last adopted in specific standards in the early 2000s. That said, on this and other questions, I will follow the comments received closely and look forward to seeing whether other options to transition to all digital mode does, in fact, allow stations to have greater and more effective reach among the listening public. I thank the Chair for his continued attention to this item and issue, and will approve the item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. It's been almost 100 years since the first licensed AM broadcast, and now nearly 50 years since one FCC chairman fell in love with the AM service. But if you have recently tuned to the AM dial on your radio, it might feel like you were transported back in time, but not in a good way. Far from being greeted by nostalgia, there are a lot of technical and other challenges that are confronting the band and degrading the signal quality. Addressing those is important, and today we start the process of giving more flexibility to broadcasters to do just that. And these are important forms of relief because these stations often tailor their programming to underserved populations and can provide an entry point for diverse station owners. That's why it's critical that we allow these stations to innovate and remain relevant in the modern media marketplace. So I want to thank the Media Bureau for its work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you to the Media Bureau for your efforts. This is a well-done rulemaking. I look forward to the record that develops, and hopefully we can create some new opportunities for the AM band as a result.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. No statement from me. I'll approve the item, and thank you so much for the hard work.
Thank you, sir. I'll have just a brief statement, which starts off by saying that the obvious, which is that AM broadcasters are a crucial component of the communities that they serve. They provide live coverage of our favorite teams' games. They provide lively talk radio that plays a critical role in our nation's political discourse. They serve minority and foreign language populations, and in our darkest times, they provide life-saving information, as shown by WKBJ AM in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which, as I heard firsthand when I was in the territory, kept broadcasting, even as Hurricane Maria ravaged the island. And if we're going to preserve this critical service, we need to bring AM radio into the 21st century. And many believe, as do we, that all digital transmission could do that. Indeed, on July 16th of 2018, WWFD AM in Frederick, Maryland, just outside our nation's capital, became the first AM station to go all digital on an experimental basis. Its experience informs this NPRM, which, as you've heard, allows AM broadcasters to decide for themselves whether a digital transmission format is the right one for them. This is, of course, just the latest step in our ongoing efforts to revitalize the AM service, and I'm eager to see how this proposal could eventually lead to the next generation of AM broadcasting. And I'd like to also extend a special thanks to Bryan Broadcasting, and in particular my friend Ben Downs, for filing the petition for rulemaking that led to today's NPRM, as well as hosting a certain FCC employee, me, when I was down in College Station, Texas. And I also want to thank the commission staff that prepared this item from the Media Bureau and from the Office of General Counsel. It has my full support. And with that, we'll move to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the work. Madam Secretary, to item number 6 we go.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the sixth item is entitled Amendment of Section 73.3556 of the Commission's rules regarding duplication of programming on commonly owned radio stations, Modernization of Media Initiative. The item will be presented by the Media Bureau, and once again, Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Okay, Ms. Carey, we turn again to you.
Thank you. The next item the Media Bureau presents is a notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on whether to modify or eliminate the radio duplication rule. This is the 18th rulemaking of our Media Modernization Initiative to eliminate or modify regulations that are outdated, unnecessary, or unduly burdensome. Joining me at the table are Brendan Holland and Julie Saunier of the Media Bureau. Julie will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on whether the Commission should modify or eliminate the radio duplication rule. Currently, this rule bars same service, AM or FM, commercial radio stations from duplicating more than 25% of their programming if the stations share substantial contour overlap and are commonly owned or subject to a time brokerage agreement. When the Commission adopted the current version of the radio duplication rule in the early 1990s, it sought to guard against excessive programming duplication that could adversely affect the public interest goals of competition, programming diversity, and spectrum efficiency. But in the more than 25 years since that time, the radio broadcast industry has changed significantly. The number of stations has increased substantially. Stations have begun to use websites and mobile applications to distribute content. Digital radio has come into existence, offering better sound quality and additional information, and the Commission has allowed AM broadcasters to access the FM spectrum through its AM revitalization efforts. Today's NPRM asks if, given the changes in the radio broadcast industry, there is a continued need for the radio duplication rule to promote competition and programming diversity, or if allowing broadcasters additional programming freedom would better promote those goals. Should the rule be retained, the NPRM seeks comment on whether limiting duplication to 25% of total hours in an average broadcast week continues to balance appropriately the benefit to radio broadcasters of repurposing costly programming with promoting competition and programming diversity, as well as whether an overlap of principal community contours of more than 50% continues to be the appropriate standard. The NPRM further asks if, given the economic and technical challenges facing AM broadcasters, the rule should treat AM service differently than FM service. Additionally, the NPRM seeks comment on whether the radio duplication rule remains necessary to promote spectrum efficiency and whether modification or elimination of the rule would affect any other Commission public interest goals, such as broadcast localism. Finally, the NPRM seeks comment on the benefits and costs associated with modification or elimination of the rule. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Merci, enchanté, Ms. Saulnier. We now turn to Commissioner O'Reilly for any comments.
I don't have a formal statement. I thank the Bureau for producing this item. I support it, and I look forward to more media modernization items.
You could have done it in French, but that's all right. No pressure. Commissioner Carter.
By my count, this is the 75th item of this morning's agenda meeting. Or at least it feels that way. I don't know. Feelings aren't fact.
Concision is for suckers.
It's actually the 75th item, truly, in the FCC's work to modernize our media regulations. And I think that number alone signifies how much work we've had to do to update and modernize and how long the FCC's media regulations have languished without update. So I think it's a good thing that we're doing that broader proceeding and this being a part of that. I also want to thank my colleagues for agreeing to seek comment on 2 additional issues in today's notice. First, we now ask about the impact of non-broadcast sources of news and information on the need for this rule. And second, we now ask whether the FCC's existing restriction on program duplication raises any First Amendment concerns. I look forward to reviewing the record that develops on those and other questions. I want to join my colleagues in thanking you all for your work on the item. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Resale.
This week, PEN America, which is a well-known organization devoted to the freedom of expression, released a new report on the status of local news in this country. You can comb through it, and you'll see lots of words like crisis, closure, and cuts. It details how newspapers and broadcasters are grappling with how to continue to produce the journalism and news gathering that Americans rely on every day. It's important because we need this news to make informed decisions about our communities, our country, and our democracy. Research shows that local news remains the most trusted form of journalism. It also is the news medium that's closest to the work of the FCC. That's because when we issue licenses for broadcasting, those licenses represent a public trust, and they come with a unique duty. Under the law, they are required to serve their community. Now, I think this background is essential context for today's rulemaking. It proposes to change a rule that prevents radio station licensees from devoting more than a quarter of their time to programming that duplicates another station in the same market. This policy was designed to support radio localism, competition, and diversity. Take it away, and the quantity of local programming in any market could easily decline. News gathering could fall by the wayside. Journalism jobs could be cut in media markets where they are already cut to the bone. Instead of promoting such outcomes, I think we should be strengthening the institutions we have to support the production of local news and journalism. I appreciate that we need to modernize our policies to reflect new realities for radio broadcasting. I also appreciate that my colleagues included some additional questions in this rulemaking at my request. But I hope that any changes we make do not lead listeners to find fewer voices and sources of local news the next time they tune in. So I choose to concur.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Much of our time here at this agency is dedicated to managing the use of spectrum, an incredibly valuable and finite public resource that powers our wireless communications from broadcasting to broadband. And as of now, it's been announced that next month's open meeting will consider how to more efficiently use two bands to enable next generation licensed and unlicensed wireless services. And moreover, we remain in the midst of a post-auction transition of our broadcast incentive auction, a groundbreaking process that we use to repurpose a vast swath of spectrum from broadcasters to wireless service providers responsive to changing market forces and consumer demands. And this context weighed in my mind as we're considering today a proceeding largely about whether to eliminate a rule preventing radio broadcasters from duplicating content on commonly owned stations in the same local area. And I can think of precious few situations where such an arrangement would be the best and most valued use of our spectrum. For that reason, I'm going to concur today as well. The prospect of allowing current radio station owners to broadcast duplicative content seems particularly questionable to me at a time when women and people of color remain largely absent from radio ownership, and opportunities for diverse new owners to enter this business we know are few and far between. Our latest data, which I must note becomes outdated every minute, indicates that women own 8% of this country's commercial FM radio stations. African Americans own 1%, Latinos 4%, Asian Americans own less than 0.5%. And what does this really mean? Out of thousands of radio station licenses awarded by the Commission, women and people of color collectively own just a few hundred, if that. And so I have concerns about eliminating or modifying rules that would best serve our goals as an agency. I'm open to hearing from our stakeholders, and to that end, and in the spirit of better understanding how a rule change here would impact diversity, I'm grateful that my colleagues agreed to add some additional questions on my behest. Namely, I am deeply interested in learning more about whether these rule changes would have any special impact on women or people of color who currently own stations or hope to enter the industry, and whether spectrum could be used more efficiently by radio operators operating and airing duplicative content, or by other parties in service to our competition and diversity goals. I'm hopeful that the parties will engage in robust discussion here. As always, thank you to the Bureau.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Starks. I will vote to approve, but will forego a statement at this time. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Riley?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Concur.
Commissioner Starks?
Concur.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted. The control privilege is granted as requested. Thanks very much. Madam Secretary, to the end we are, almost.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, the 7th and final item is entitled Misuse of Internet Protocol Captioned Telephone Service, Telecommunications Relay Services, and Speech-to-Speech Services for Individuals and with Hearing and Speech Disabilities. The item will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. Diane Burstein, Deputy Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. We turn to you, Ms. Burstein, for your comments.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau presents to you a draft report and order on Internet Protocol Captioned Telephone Service, or IPCTS. This item would modify the Commission's rules on contributions to the Telecommunications Relay Service Fund for the support of IPCTS to ensure both that the burden of funding this service is borne more equitably and that this vital service be sustainable over the long term. I would like to thank the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau staff for their hard work on this proceeding. I would also like to thank the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of the General Counsel, Office of the Managing Director, Office of Communications Business Opportunities, Wireline Competition Bureau, and the Enforcement Bureau for their assistance with this item. Joining me at the table today are Bob Aldrich, CGB's front office legal advisor, and Elliot Greenwald, Deputy Division Chief in the Disability Rights Office. Bob will present the item.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I'm pleased to present this draft report and order on IPCTS. This item would modify how TRS fund contributions are determined for the purpose of supporting IPCTS, an internet-based form of telecommunications relay service, or TRS. IPCTS allows telephone users with hearing loss to both read captions and use their residual hearing to understand a telephone conversation. If the report and order is adopted, the intrastate end-user revenues of telecommunications carriers and voice-over Internet Protocol, or VoIP, service providers would be included in the calculation of TRS fund contributions to support the costs of providing IPCTS. The current funding approach, whereby the entire cost of IPCTS is paid for through the TRS fund based on contributions from interstate end-user revenues, was adopted in 2007 on an interim basis. With this report and order, contributions to the TRS fund to support IPCTS would be calculated based on the total interstate and intrastate end-user revenues of each telecommunications carrier and each provider of VoIP services. Intrastate-only telecommunications carriers and VoIP service providers would be required to contribute to the TRS fund for the support of IPCTS. Adding intrastate end-user revenues to the calculation of TRS fund contributions would ensure that the burden of funding IPCTS is distributed more equitably among carriers, service providers, and their customers, and would help harmonize voice telecom pricing accordingly. The inclusion of intrastate revenue also would broaden and thereby strengthen the funding base for IPCTS. To implement these changes, which will govern TRS fund contributions beginning July 1st, 2020, a single IPCTS contribution factor will be applied to TRS fund contributors' total end-user revenues. This contribution factor will be computed by dividing the TRS fund's IPCTS revenue requirement by contributors' total interstate and intrastate end-user revenues. There will be no net change to the total contributions needed to support IPCTS. TRS fund contributions for other purposes will be calculated in the same manner as today by dividing the remaining fund revenue requirement by contributors' interstate end-user revenues. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges for technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aldrich, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
I will submit my statement for the record and thank the Bureau for their work on this. I do believe we have to get to the overall cost of the program, and I will look forward to that at some future time. I thank the Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Thanks for your presentation, and since I was clean-shaven when this meeting started, I will skip my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Resale.
Because this is well done and also in the interest of something called lunch, I too will not have a statement, and I will just say that this has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, I will vote to approve as well. Thank you for your hard work as ever.
What they said.
Yeah.
I approve. Commissioner O'Reilly. How do you
Aye.
vote? Sorry.
So fast.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. Thanks for the vote, for the work. It has our full support. Do any of my colleagues have any announcements at this time? I was
point
pretty
that out.
fast. Yeah, ruthless
Yeah.
efficiency at the end of this
I
meeting.
do, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Commissioner Starks.
Thank you. For folks who have not met her yet, I'd like to introduce my new legal advisor for Wireline and public safety issues, Austin Bonner. There she is. Austin comes to the FCC from the law firm that many of us know, Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis, where she split her time between FCC advocacy and appellate litigation. and Wallet Harris. Austin also served as an adjunct professor at her alma mater, Georgetown University Law Center. Austin's career includes time as a press secretary, a Third Circuit clerk, and internships at the White House and at Free Press. She has been to more than 30 countries and is learning to play the ukulele. We'll be eager to have a mini concert that folks can be invited to. We're very excited to have Austin on board. Congratulate her for making it through your first meeting. Well done, Austin. Thank you.
So a few announcements from me. First, a sad milestone, which is to mark the passing of Gray Pash, who was a longtime attorney in the Office of General Counsel. Gray started at the FCC in May 1971, straight out of the University of Kentucky Law School. He was hired by the then General Counsel, somebody named Dick Wiley, who went on to do something later at the Commission, as I understand it. Gray held the same position as a staff attorney in the FCC's litigation division for more than 48 years. He served under 14 FCC chairs and 2 acting chairs, starting with Dean Birch. He argued almost 75 cases and briefed almost 200 cases, and was given the FCC's Gold Medal for Distinguished Service in 1997. He handled a wide variety of cases across the agency's jurisdiction: children's television, the Fairness Doctrine, media ownership, broadcast and decency, low power FM, diversity in broadcast ownership, the analog to digital TV transition, cable rate regulation, cable program access regulation, video relay services, reg fees, traffic pumping, pole attachments, incentive auction, other spectrum auctions, local number portability administrator, and the application of environmental and historic preservation regulations to cell towers and other wireless infrastructure. The incredible amount of work he put in over the years. The first reported case in which Gray's name appears is a case he argued in December in 1974, RAM Broadcasting of Texas versus FCC, and he won it. He filed his final brief in March 2019 and presented his last oral argument in May 2018 in Sorensen Communications versus FCC, and he won that one too, prevailing over the former Solicitor General of the United States, Don Verrilli. Gray was a good friend to many who had the chance to work with him, including me when I was in the Office of General Counsel and in this role. With great condolences to his family and with tremendous gratitude to his public service, Gray, we bid you rest in peace, sir. Well, we also have to announce the departure of our intern, Victoria Rendazzo, who is here. Victoria, if you don't mind standing up, as one must do, I'm afraid. Victoria did a terrific job in our office over the past several months on a wide variety of issues. She also worked in the Office of Economics and Analytics, which is where we first took note of her aptitude and dedication. She is a student at George Mason University, and as I have mentioned, she was a student of Josh Wright's, and we had a chance to have a great conversation about the intersection of FCC and FTC regulation over there. Victoria, you've done a tremendous job in our office. We look forward to bigger and better things from you in the future, and do be in touch. We're very excited about what the future holds for you. Next, WRC 19, the World Radio Communication Conference. It concluded today in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. After 4 weeks, the United States has achieved impressive results. For example, ensuring global harmonization for critical high-band spectrum for 5G and providing spectrum and technological and regulatory frameworks required to foster next-generation satellite services while still providing protections to passive services. And I want to say that I'm tremendously proud of the FCC's incredible team that represented the United States as part of the delegation to the World Radio Communication Conference, in particular from the International Bureau. Louis Bell, Clay DeSell, Neshe Gundelsberger, Dante Ibarra, Catherine Medley, Mike Mullenix, Bob Nelson, Sankar Prasad, Tom Sullivan, and Alan Yang. Folks, you have no idea how many hours these folks put in on the minutia of international procedures and processes and policies that advance the ball for United States interests and are going to deliver value for consumers in the years to come. I also want to thank other folks at the FCC, in particular Commissioner O'Reilly and his advisor, Aaron McGrath, my indefatigable international advisor, Aaron Goldberger, as well as his predecessor, Rachel Bender, who, oh man, God help you guys for all you've done on this issue, and as well as others at the Commission who have helped support their efforts. We really appreciate it. Last but not least, it is my pleasure to announce this morning the winners of the FCC's annual Excellence in Economic Analysis, Excellence in Engineering Analysis, and Employee of the Year awards. The first two awards recognize Commission staff for outstanding economic, analytic, scientific, or technical contributions to the FCC's work. Nominations are reviewed by selecting committees comprised of experts from across the agency. The Employee of the Year Award recognizes bargaining unit employees who have made outstanding contributions to our agency, including through their quality performance, creativity, problem solving, or customer service. Nominations for this award are reviewed by a joint union and management committee. And after the meeting, I'll be presenting each of today's award winners with a commemorative plaque. The winners of this year's Excellence in Economic Analysis Award are Matthew Collins, Catherine LaPiccolo, Patrick Sun, and Alexander Yankelevich of the Office of Economics and Analytics. I don't know if they are here. Yes, they are here. All right. They are receiving this award for their substantial and comprehensive economic analysis of the proposed merger of T-Mobile and Sprint. Their work combined rigorous application of standard merger evaluation techniques with novel methods that were necessary to evaluate the proposed transaction and to address the multitude of arguments in the record concerning its competitive ramifications. Thank you to them, and more generally, thank you to all of the economists and other professionals in the Office of Economics and Analytics who worked on this transaction. The winner of this year's Excellence in Engineering Analysis Award is Johnny Lee from the Enforcement Bureau's Dallas office. Is Johnny? All right, yeah. Everything is bigger in Texas, and that applies as well to Johnny's work. He is receiving this award for his efforts in developing a mobile broadband LTE coverage and service drive test survey package to support the Mobility Fund 2 project. Congratulations, sir, for the award. And there are multiple awards of this year's Employee of the Year award. William Beckwith of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau is receiving this award for streamlined improvements to a decade-old annual data collection process, analysis, and report. Congratulations to him. Jonathan McCormick of the Office of Economics and Analytics is receiving this award for his contributions in designing, overseeing, and launching facets of the MF2 challenge process. Congratulations to you. Jim Scott of the Enforcement Bureau is receiving this award for his coordination with the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, as well as repairs to the FCC's damaged Type 1 site in Puerto Rico in the wake of Hurricane Maria. And I don't know if he is here, but wherever you are, Jim, we appreciate very much your efforts in that regard. And a team award is being presented to Anthony Asongwed, Tawanda Bryant, Kathleen Campbell, Jay Lim, Eleanor Lott, Trang Nguyen, and Jeanette Springs of the International Bureau, who helped successfully implement a new 6-month application window for C-band Earth station operators to register with the FCC. Now, some suggested that we have a private company hand out their award, but I thought it was important for the FCC to do it, so I will go ahead and do that now. I would like to congratulate all of these award winners for their outstanding public service and contributions to the mission of this agency. It's an honor and a privilege to have you as colleagues, and I look forward to even greater things in the time to come. Madam Secretary, if you don't mind giving the American public the date of the next FCC open agenda meeting.
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Thursday, December 12th, 2019.
Until then, we stand adjourned.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. If everyone wants to please take your seats and your conversations outside, we can go ahead and get started with the first of the press conferences, which is the one with Chairman Pai. So I will go ahead and turn it over to the chairman to make some opening remarks, and then we're happy to take questions from reporters. So take it away, Chairman.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tina. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm sure this crowd has memorized the opening of the Communications Act of 1934, but for any newcomers in the room, allow me to offer a brief refresher. The FCC's founding statute begins with Section 1, which lays out the purposes for creating the FCC. And the first purpose is to make available communication services to all the people of the United States. And let me read you the next two reasons for establishing our agency. For the purpose of the national defense, for the purpose of promoting safety and life. I'm proud to say that we meaningfully advanced each of those purposes today. To promote the national defense, the FCC unanimously adopted rules that will prohibit the use of Universal Service Fund dollars to purchase equipment or services from any company, like Huawei or ZTE, that poses a national security threat. We also proposed a process to remove and replace any equipment from such companies from USF-funded communications networks. Our message is clear. When it comes to network security, especially as we begin deployment of 5G, the next generation of wireless connectivity, we cannot and will not simply take a risk and hope for the best. The stakes are too high. Additionally, to promote the safety of life, we closed a critical gap in our 911 system. After years of study and testing, we finally adopted a vertical location accuracy standard of plus or minus 3 meters. Today, you heard the International Association of Firefighters testify that they and many other public safety organizations support this metric because it will more accurately identify a 911 caller's floor level and is achievable. Helping first responders identify the vertical location of 911 callers will help them do their jobs even better and will ultimately save lives. With that, I would welcome your questions.
Howard, starts off.
Okay, Howard Busker, Communications Daily. I wanted to ask you about 911. I think there have been some concerns that I picked up in the public safety world that this is that by adopting these standards, it's a move away from dispatchable location, and which was sort of the big theme back in 2015. Can you give us an update on how do you sort of view dispatchable location, and will the FCC be continuing to move forward on that?
Look, I think I can't put it any better than General President Schaitberger did, that this is a meaningful step forward today in terms of promoting public safety and saving lives. And he doesn't stand alone. He stands with the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the National Sheriff's Association, and many others in supporting the plus or minus 3 meter metric. Going forward, as I mentioned, we are looking at more tightening that metric over time as technology evolves. But the bottom line is that we want to make sure that all of us are working together to establish achievable and meaningful improvements in our public safety system. And that is why I'm grateful to the bipartisan majority of the Commission for adopting the metric today that we believe was supported not just by the public safety organizations, but by the facts in our record.
Thank
you. Monty Taylor, Com Daily. Chairman Pai, it was suggested to me that the FCC could get around the appeals process with the Third Circuit if they broke certain rules out of the 2018 quadrennial review and just passed them on their own, such as just doing subcap regulation on its own. Is that something you'd be into? And also, are you appealing that case to the Supreme Court? Why or why not?
So what I can say is that we are studying the recent decision from the Third Circuit and have not yet made a decision about how to proceed.
Hey, Margaret McGill with Axios here. I have a question on the C-band proceeding. An FCC official told reporters that President Trump called you to discuss the C-band, but he did not express an opinion. Can you give us some insight into what the president did say and how this call affected your decision on C-band?
The president called me and told me that Senator Kennedy had called him, and he was just calling to ask what the issue was, and he did not express a view on the merits of the proceeding at all, so it didn't affect our decision.
It did not affect your decision? Is that what you?
It did not affect our decision, no.
Hi, Chairman. Kelsey Griffiths from Law 360. Yesterday in a speech, you suggested that carriers have not been moving as quickly as you would like them to in implementing Shake and Stir, and that you might actually roll out some new regulations early next year. In August, you said that the carriers were doing a pretty good job and that you did expect them to be in compliance with Shake and Stir by the end of this year. What happened between then and now to make you change your mind and to direct staff to start making those rules ready?
Well, so I regularly get updates from the FCC's team on how implementation of the Shake and Stir framework is going, and I wanted to reiterate my expectation that we want that deadline to be met. And one of the things I outlined yesterday in my speech with Governor Baker was that I have directed the FCC staff to be prepared to move to report an order, to be able to adopt regulations early next year. having issued the notice of proposed rulemaking earlier this year to put us in a position to go down that road. And so I simply want to put the major companies on notice that we do mean what we say when we say that we want that shake and stir framework to be implemented by the end of the year. And we're going to be in a position to move ahead to ensure that that framework is adopted one way or the other.
Go to our next question.
I'm Yuka with NHK, Japanese Public TV.
Ah, sure.
I would like to ask you about the Huawei.
Okay.
What's your response? Okay. I'll repeat. Sorry. I'd like to ask you about the Huawei.
Okay.
What's your response that the U.S. has not shown the clear evidence of backdoors or allegations of information being leaked?
So several different factors that were evidenced in our record. In particular, the fact that China has a national intelligence law that requires any company subject to its jurisdiction to comply with requests from the Chinese intelligence services. That law further prohibits any company receiving such a request from disclosing it to any of its customers, either in China or abroad. Obviously, Huawei is a company subject to Chinese jurisdiction, and notwithstanding whatever representations may be made, I find it very hard to believe, and I doubt that any other reasonable observer would believe, that the company would resist such a request if it were presented, particularly given the demonstrated willingness of the Chinese government just over the last several weeks to exercise its leverage over things, as I mentioned, like basketball and Taiwanese flag emojis and the like. Secondly, as I pointed out, independent observers around the world have identified serious security flaws in some of the Huawei equipment and services that have been proffered for use in communications networks. That, along with all of the other evidence amassed by the Commission, both in a classified and unclassified setting, persuades us to speak unanimously on behalf of the FCC that the presence of that equipment in our networks, both existing and going forward, would present an unacceptable risk to national security. And I think the strong voice you heard from the dais today is evidence of the fact that this is not a political issue at all for any of the FCC commissioners, and I dare say for the United States government. It's simply a question of how best do we promote the security of our communications network and our communications supply chain.
Casey?
Hi, Chairman. On the C-band decision you announced this week, could you just talk a little bit about how you arrived at specifically 280 megahertz as the amount of spectrum for the public auction?
Oh, I can't comment on the particulars about the decision, but what I will simply say is that the C-band Alliance put forward, as you know, 300 megahertz, including 280 megahertz that would be repurposed for 5G spectrum. And so that was a template that we thought was appropriate for making our decision.
Jeremy Bloomberg Law. The Department of Transportation wants to keep the entire 75 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band reserved for auto safety. How do you resolve this conflict between the agencies, and will the FCC move forward with repurposing the band even if DOT still opposes that?
I think you resolved the conflict the exact way that I proposed to do earlier this week, and that proposal is now public. It's on the internet, anyone can read it, and it essentially recognizes the reality that 22 years after the FCC made a decision to allocate 75 megahertz of spectrum for DSRC, that technology has not progressed as people originally thought. And so what we have tried to do, based in part on consultation with the Department of Transportation, is take a very thoughtful approach. On one hand, we recognize, of course, that automotive safety is important, that automotive safety into the future will depend on wireless connectivity. And so we have flagged 20 megahertz in the upper part of the 5.9 gigahertz band for connected vehicle to everything, or CV2X technologies. Additionally, we have identified an additional 10 megahertz, and we've sought public input on whether that 10 megahertz should be devoted exclusively to DSRC. For example, the Japanese currently have a 10 megahertz channel that is allocated for DSRC purposes, or whether that too should be devoted to CV2X. And for the remaining 45 megahertz in the lower part of the 5.9 gigahertz band, we recognize that unlicensed operations, Wi-Fi in particular, could provide tremendous benefits, not just because of that 45 megahertz block, because it also sits adjacent to a large amount rather, of 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi spectrum. And so that unmitigated 160 megahertz wide channel could provide up to gigabit Wi-Fi for consumers. And that obviously provides tremendous benefits to the end user directly, but there are also other applications and services that could be developed that could benefit consumers in a tremendous way. So in our view, at least, we've taken a very thoughtful approach. We haven't gone all the way to one extreme or the other. We've tried to provide a win for each sector, and I think that's exactly what we've done.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is, where is the Commission in reviewing the licenses, the China Unicom and China Telecom licenses, and when will we see a decision on that?
I can't give you a particular time frame, but I can say that it is under active review by the FCC staff, including staff in my office.
With NTD-TV. My question is regarding your proposal of removing and replacing the existing Huawei and ZTE equipment. So can you talk more about what's your timeline, like what's your priorities, and what's the estimated cost range about that?
So no particular timeline, and I can't give you the estimated cost. That's precisely why we took this step today, is to try to figure out what are the various dimensions of the issue. For example, looking at some of the equipment that is already installed in our networks, we want to get public feedback, in particular from some of the carriers that have deployed it, on where this equipment is, how much it would cost to replace, what the time frame for doing so would be, and in addition, what would be the funding mechanisms. We look to Congress, for example, to provide one of those funding mechanisms, and we would, of course, have to work with Congress on setting up that system. And so that's, yeah, I can't give you the specific time frame,
But do you have like priorities? For example, like the national security related places or military defense related places, something like that?
Yeah, so obviously it's a tremendous priority for us to move forward on this going forward, but I can't speak at this time as to what particular parts of the country or types of facilities we would focus on first.
Thanks, Tina. Chairman, the FCC is listed on the Federal Acquisition Security Council, the interagency group working to write the rule to implement the President's order on ICT imports, and major bipartisan legislation in Congress for securing 5G networks. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force is considering work streams for its second year. What would you like to see this key interagency task force take on in its next phase, and how do you think cybersecurity is affected by the absence of the FCC on the executive committee of that task force?
It's not affected at all. We work regularly with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I would encourage you to talk to Director Chris Krebs and ask him about the collaboration we have had between our agencies, between the two of us personally. I've worked with him on a wide variety of issues, both publicly and privately, and I can tell you that we share not just our appreciation of the importance of this issue, but our dedication to doing the necessary legwork to ensure that our ICT networks are secure.
And the first part of my question, if that's okay, what would you like to see the task force work on in year two? I mean, I've definitely heard you say, talk about your collaboration with Director Krebs in the past. I appreciate that. But can you think of a reason why the FCC shouldn't be on the executive committee, which takes a leading role in deciding the work streams of that task force?
My understanding is that we're on the working groups, but regardless of what you see on a piece of paper saying who's a member of this or that, all I can tell you is that I talk to Chris regularly, and we are plugged in together, our agencies are plugged in together, and at the end of the day, it is very close collaboration that I think is going to benefit the American people.
So do you have a view on what the task force should be working on?
No.
Hi. Go ahead. Thank you. In your discussions with T-Mobile, Sprint, and Dish Network before the merger, did you have any discussions with any or all of them about whether or how they'll use American technology in their 5G networks?
So the leadership of T-Mobile made clear that they would not use untrusted vendors in the 5G network that they were going to construct. And our understanding is, of course, that the new T-Mobile will share that commitment, will carry that commitment forward. So.
And Dish?
Oh, Dish as well. I've had discussions with them as well about the need to use trusted vendors. And are
they a vendor of their own technology?
No, they're not.
Sorry. Just a couple questions on Spectrum. First on the C-band, can you commit to starting that auction by the end of next year?
One of the things I've made clear is that I anticipate we will be able to can start the auction in 2020. Yes.
Okay, and then on 5.9, this issue's dragged on for years and years, obviously. There's been testing for a long time. What prompted you to make this decision now? The auto companies have said, hey, let's keep doing the testing. Was it just your determination that you think long-term the the safety benefits are not there to retain the entire amount, or is it that you think the same goals can be met in the 30 megahertz rather than 75?
At the end of the day, the American people deserve to benefit from this public resource. It has been 2 decades since the FCC made a decision to allocate this spectrum exclusively for the use of DSRC. That technology has not progressed as originally anticipated. And to us, the thoughtful, balanced approach that we have taken, dedicating 30 megahertz to automotive safety and 45 megahertz to unlicensed operations allows the best of both worlds. Consumers can benefit through the the innovative new potential uses of connected vehicle to everything technologies and the like, and they can also benefit from the unlicensed innovation that applications like Wi-Fi have offered over the last 2 decades.
We'll go to our next question at this point. Go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is Julia from Sound of Hope Radio Network. Thanks for your Chairman Pai, you announced briefly about World Cyber Conference in Egypt and success from American team. China has promoted their advantage in 5G as that they would be leading this area. We read the news from Taiwan. Some of Taiwan vendors and companies, they want to learn from them, learn from Huawei, such as large company in Taiwan, Taijidian, they still produce chips to Huawei as their supply chain company. So could you elaborate the superiority, American superiority in 5G area? Thank you.
Bukachi, thank you for the question. So what I would say, well, I have a few different responses. First, or E, I should say, we do believe that America is leading in 5G development and deployment. For example, the FCC, through the 5G Fast Plan, has been executing on each component, allocating more spectrum for the commercial marketplace, speeding up the process of deploying small cell infrastructure, and making it easier to deploy the optical fiber that is necessary to carry that internet traffic to the core of the networks. Number 2, we also have seen the private companies in the United States actively developing 5G technologies. My understanding is that by the end of this year, we will have something like 92 commercial deployments of 5G services in the United States, with more to come. We're also seeing approximately 200,000 small cells being deployed by the end of this year. And at least in 2018, the deployment of optical fiber set a record for homes and businesses. Moving forward, of course, we're going to continue to be active. We have, of course, a millimeter wave auction coming up on December 10th. We have an auction of 3.5 gigahertz spectrum scheduled for June 25th of 2020. And as I mentioned in my response to Mr. Shepardson, we anticipate commencing the C-band auction in 2020 as well. But generally speaking, going forward, I think the United States does have some significant advantages. Number 1 is that we do have some companies that are looking to innovate in this area. Although there are no US-based global suppliers of equipment that are competitive with Huawei and Ericsson and Nokia in particular, I've had the chance to meet with some of the entrepreneurs who are working on virtualizing that network equipment. Just this week, for example, I spoke with a company based in Boston that is using a software-centric approach to essentially drive down costs, but also enhance security, promote efficiency, and other advantages for 5G networks. And that virtualization is something that I think could allow us to have the best of both worlds, quick and efficient deployment, but also security at the same time. So I feel very good about where the United States is positioned and look forward to delivering more results in the time to come, including next month, where we're going to be voting, among other things, on some very important mid-band spectrum initiatives.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Brendan Bordelon with National Journal. So the national security order and proposal, obviously all the commissioners voted for it, but this is a relatively new area, I think, for the commission. And there did seem to be a bit of a split regarding the FCC's broader authorities on national security. So you had Commissioner O'Reilly, I think, warning against an overbroad interpretation of that authority, perhaps suggesting to pump the brakes a little bit on future orders. Then I think all the other commissioners said something to the effect of, this is a first step. There's a lot more things we'd like to do. And I think pretty much every single one of them offered some potential proposals down the line, even moving beyond Huawei and ZTE into other areas. So I wanted to ask you, do you anticipate that national security is going to become an extensive part of the FCC's portfolio moving forward? And if so, do you share any of Commissioner O'Reilly's concerns, and do you have any plan to address those concerns?
I do think that national security will continue to occupy an important place on the FCC's agenda. As I mentioned in my opening, Section 1 of the Communications Act establishes as one of the purpose for creating the agency national defense, and we take that responsibility very seriously. I'm more than happy to work with my fellow colleagues. I have an open door and an open mind when it comes to exploring the limits of our authority, as well as the substantive policies that they believe we should be pursuing. But I think the fact that, again, we spoke with a unified voice on this particular issue today demonstrates that when it comes to the national security of our ICT networks, there is no Republican perspective or Democratic perspective on this issue. It's simply an American perspective. And as public servants looking to advance the national defense, that is certainly the spirit with which I would hope my colleagues and I would approach these discussions.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Todd Shields, Bloomberg News. How much should Intelsat and SES be paid from a public auction of the C-band airways? How much should they be paid?
I'm not going to make any comment on some of the decision-making that we have to make in regard to the C-band at this time.
Hi, Chairman. Very similar question, but
it's going to be a similar answer.
a little bit different. So FCC staff said they were confident that the FCC could align the incentives of the satellite companies with the FCC's to clear the spectrum as quickly as possible. So without getting into the amount, what mechanisms are being considered to align these incentives?
Again, that's part of the internal decision-making that we're doing right now, so I can't comment on it at this time. Sorry. Okay, happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mark Wickfield.
Somebody left their phone.
So let's see, I think we'll take both wireline items at the same time. So there would be the supply chain security item and the uni item. So if wireline wants to come up, I assume there's questions on supply chain? Yeah, or one of them.
Other than Commissioner Carr's, I guess, addition about the FCC's authority to mandate that all carriers can't buy insecure equipment, even if it's not federally funded. Was there anything else that was added beyond that?
That's a part of the notice of proposed rulemaking, and so
Okay.
we added some questions along those lines.
All right, but nothing that would venture into territory that's not necessarily under that umbrella?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, so got it.
Yeah.
Communications Daily, real quick then. So there were some questions added to the NPRM, but were there any changes of note to the actual rules themselves?
As if you've been following this and looking in the docket, there's been many ex parte filings that were made by various parties, including Huawei and RWA, CCA, US Telecom. And so we have addressed those ex partes as part of our process, as well as responded to suggestions from the offices. So yes, there have been changes. There have been some clarifications as to the interpretation and the scope of the rule, things along those lines.
Any sense when you might be able, this one sounds like it could be a little while to get finished before you can release it.
I'm not going to predict when we will
Right,
get
no,
it out the door, but I don't think it will be a significant lapse here in time before we get it
Okay,
out the door.
thank you.
Can you talk about the UNE item at all?
Where's my uni team? Yes, go ahead.
And just, can you walk me through any changes in some of the questions that they're adding?
That were in the item from the public version?
That you're adding to the one that you'll release later?
Oh, well, as Chris mentioned before, for the item that she just spoke about, if you look at the ex partes, there were some, made some comments that we've responded to in the item itself.
And anything in particular you want to highlight?
No.
I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other on these two items? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The next item is the 911 location accuracy item. Are there questions on that item? Okay. How about the suspension and debarment rules? Okay. Digital AM? Monty? I'm good. Okay. Duplicative programming rule for the Media Bureau? No? Okay, and the last one was IPCTS. Any questions on that?
Do you know if there were any changes?
I don't know. Okay, I think we have the commissioners are here. Thank you.
Diligent, faithful folks. How goes it? Can we answer any questions you may have?
Yes, thank you both. Kelsey Griffiths from Law 360, if I hadn't said that already. I wanted to see if both of you could talk about authority for assessing whether the FCC can tell carriers they can't buy from insecure network vendors. It definitely seems like the Commission believes that it does have the authority to extend that authority when those subsidies, or when that equipment is covered by subsidies, but what would be your basis for extending that further?
Well, I think what you heard me say was the Commission put forward a number of different arguments on authority in the item. I agree with a number of them. There were a couple I thought were probably outside my interpretation of the statute. And I didn't think they were necessary to be raised since we had sufficient authority. I did hear the chairman talk about Section 1 in the past. It has not been interpreted to provide us any authority. So there are stretches, there are reaches to what we can and can't do. But I look forward to seeing what the Commission puts forward as the time may permit.
I asked to expand the further notice to include this idea of going beyond just networks that are funded through universal service. I understand the argument that our universal service authority presents clear or arguably very clear legal authority. I know Commissioner Rosenworcel, for her part, also expressed similar ideas in terms of expanding beyond just networks supported through universal service. And we are looking at a number of different potential sources of authority for that, and I haven't personally made a final decision, but I think there's enough there at this point to proceed with seeking comment on those issues, and we'll review the record as it comes in.
Hi, Brendan Bordelon with National Journal. I actually have a pretty similar question, but I guess it's a little broader, just related to what looks like a tilt at the Commission towards a more national security-focused mission, partially in response, I think, to the Chinese concern, but also I think in response to some other concerns that were laid out by several of the commissioners this morning as sort of next steps. And for both of you, I'm just interested in your view on that, if you feel like this isn't an appropriate role for the FCC to take on, not just with this telecommunication Huawei ZTE thing, but really for months and years in the future with several of the other orders, proposals laid out today and that might be laid out in the future. Is this sort of the right direction for the Commission, or is there sort of a limit to the Commission's authority in this space?
I think the Commission certainly has authority and certainly has a role to play here. I think you heard the chairman talk about how it's not a role that we're doing alone. We are coordinated with a lot of other different agencies that also have responsibility in this space. I think part of it is, as a lot of us talked about on the dais, when you look at 5G, the number of connected devices is increasing, the number of things that are connected are increasing. And so I think we are, staying within our authority, working with other lead agencies on this issue, and these are important issues that we're moving on.
Well, the hard part about your question is it's mixing a couple different issues. Sure. On national security, I think you saw us unified in decision making. If you talk about network security, I think there's a difference of opinion, and I have written extensively about this in the past, and you can see that work, and I don't think the Commission has extensive authority. I think Commissioner Carr just mentioned out lead agencies. The Commission is governed by statute and the authority that Congress has given to it. In the network security space, Congress has given authority to others and other agencies, and I have to be respectful and mindful of that. And I have said multiple times, if Congress changes that authority, I will do whatever it asks me to do in statute. But I can't create visions and create provisions to accomplish a goal that I may fully agree with. So that's where I stand on the issue. But national security, in terms of our role, in terms of the authorizations that we have, or in terms of authority in USF, I think it exists, and we're pleased to support today's item. We continue to take viewpoints from Team Telecom and have a process, and I've been working extensively to try and simplify or streamline that process, but I do value their opinion and their take on different issues as it pertains to items we have before us. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I wanted to ask, Howard Busker, Cumdale, I wanted to ask about, Commissioner O'Reilly, you just got back from the WRC. Did you have any, I know last time, 4 years ago, you had a lot of concerns about how that one ended up. And unfortunately, the briefing calls were during the FCC meeting today, so I haven't heard the briefing calls. But what's your general impression? I mean, are there areas where you are still concerned, or areas where you think that we're moving in the right direction? Just sort of where are things right now, based on your impressions?
Well, in fairness, I only spent the last 6 days there. The other folks had spent 4.5 weeks and have much more ingrained knowledge of the day in, day in. But there are some things I will eventually get to. I'm calling it kind of an autopsy of WRC from my take, and probably going to take me a little bit of time to digest. I'm a little tired from the flight yesterday, but I think it's both. I do have some concerns with what I saw. I do have concerns with how nations are proceeding in a WRC environment. I think they're consistent with my past concerns. So I do think there are some concerns. I appreciate that we had some successes at WRC, and there's some parts of it that I'm still digesting because they resolved after I left, or they were still, the landing spots I could hear, but I didn't see, actual text. So I have some work to do, and I don't want to probably get too far ahead on that. Is that fair?
Yeah, okay. And Commissioner Carr, I wanted to ask you if you had, or both of you actually, but since you're the lead on wireless infrastructure, we just had a bunch of, just key filings this week on CTIA, WIA petition.
I love how you are laser focused on infrastructure. You and I are like cut from the same cloth on this.
Right, exactly. But I wanted to ask you, do you have any update for us, or sort of what your latest thoughts are? You're still just doing sort of a wait and see approach.
Yeah, I still have to do my own deep dive in the record and hope to free that up time to do that. And I don't have any timeline in terms of when I'll complete that review or next steps for the agency and that to share at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, we're weeks away from the start of 2020, both an election year and a census year. Can you talk a little bit about the FCC's?
I think a leap year too. I think you left that out.
Yeah, do you have a role in that too? But what role does the FCC play in protecting the integrity of electronic voting rolls and polling stations, and to the extent that broadband will play a greater role in next year's census, in making sure that those unserved by broadband will be counted?
I think stepping back, you have a whole of government approach to these issues, and I would defer you most directly to the sector-specific lead on a lot of these issues, which is the Department of Homeland Security. Of course, the FCC is at the table for all of these discussions. But I'd leave it either to the chairman's office to give you more insights specifically on what he's doing, and then of course to the other lead agencies, whether it's the federal government or the state government that are involved on those issues.
Thanks.
I think there are limitations on our authority, and Congress has looked to other agencies to be the lead in that. If they change those equations, I'm happy to participate as appropriate. I know some folks are very interested in the election integrity and things of that nature. I was scratching my head to figure out how that would, come within our bailiwick. On the census, I just have to hear more arguments and what people are expecting out of us, and how does it match up with our statute?
Thanks.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Because the CBA worked so closely with the FCC in agreeing to free up 300 megahertz, are you worried about setting a bad precedent if, say, they're not compensated beyond clearing costs?
Well, I think I've look at some of these things are pretty raw in terms of the decisions that are, I'm having a tough time digesting how you get participation without some type of incentive. So just getting clearing costs, I don't know how people who how companies that have legal rights and use FCC licenses would be, their footprint would be shrunk. I don't know a precedent that people would be pointing to for that instance. And that's why you see extensive talk in discussions about this issue, and why I think there has to be some type of incentive, and was willing to do one that led to speed. So I'm still trying to figure some of those things out, and I don't know how you would do that and what precedent would we be setting for every other auction going forward if we make the argument that we can take your license as will be. I think that's really troubling for initially, and I'd have to see what arguments are put forward that would suggest that that's a not only sound decision, but it's consistent with the statute.
Yeah, I agree. We want to make sure that there are incentives out there for incumbent license holders who maybe aren't using their spectrum to its highest and valued use, potentially because of restrictions on FCC licenses, to raise their hand and identify themselves to the FCC. We can do some of that work for sure, but it's nice to have some incentive out there for someone to raise their hand. Another key issue through this proceeding obviously has been speed. And recently that gap between an FCC auction and a private sale has closed considerably. And the FCC has now talked about completing this auction in 2020, which is the right call, and that really closes that gap between public and private. I've met with some of the C-band Alliance members within the last few days, and I don't get the sense that anybody is dug in opposition to the approach that we're pursuing. I still think within this framework, there can be the right incentives for everybody, the American people, CBA, satellite operators outside of that, and most importantly, our 5G builds to see a win out of this. And I think at this point, we're all focused on that. So I don't think we have turned a corner in which all of the incentives for either CBA or for other providers in other areas to not see an upside to them, and from my perspective for the country, by getting this done in 2020.
Hi, gentlemen. Todd Shields, Bloomberg News. So on the payment to Intelsat, SES, Eutelsat, the other C-band companies, they should get, what, clearing cost plus something? How much of a something can you say right now?
These are going to be some of the issues that are going to be teed up, hopefully very quickly, in a notice at the commission. But yeah, my guardrail for this proceeding all along, which I articulated, 6+ months ago, is we got to get, around 300 megahertz. We got to have a transparent process. We got to return a significant amount of money to the Treasury. And again, the announcement recently didn't go from CBA gets 100% of the proceeds and the Treasury gets 0 to the flip of that. Before the announcement, they had walked out to 50% contribution, up to a 75% contribution in some circumstances. So I think there are a variety of mechanisms that we are going to explore and quickly resolve that is going to make sure that everybody, to the extent they're being reasonable, will have the incentives to make this work out quickly.
I don't have an artificial number in my head of what the contribution or some type of payment. I'm still, trying to digest how we would actually issue such a payment, given the structure of the statute. I think I've said since my first day in the commission, previous in my testimony, that I'm governed by the statute and what our authority is. I worked extensively on 309J in the past life, and so I don't know exactly how these things match up with what people are talking about these days. Money has not been my number one goal in this, and you can look back at I've been working on this for 3 years, and articulated viewpoints before almost anybody on this topic, and outlined 4 principles on the topic. I think one that no one seems to mention anymore is how does it impact 6 gigahertz item, but you can see back onto those things. So money hasn't been my particular issue, because just getting into a food fight, whether it's this percentage or that percentage, does get you into a situation which we're exactly in, is how do you get to the speed issue.
So do you oppose the course that Mr. Pai laid out on Monday?
I don't oppose it. I'm looking forward to reading it and seeing what it entails. I only have had minimal conversations, and I'm trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together.
Just one, Commissioner Carr, you mentioned the Montana missile base as an example of a.
I was not the only one, but for the record.
I know. But do you think, going forward in terms of the ripping and replacing that equipment, should the U.S. prioritize those areas, or do you think the money would flow quickly enough that all the equipment would come out at roughly the same time?
These are part of the issues that I think are going to be teed up in the, or that are in fact teed up in the further notice, and that we should be getting feedback on. It was meaningful to me to get out there, to stand in these fields in Montana, be at the tower sites with the Huawei gear and the Huawei label right there, and get a firsthand experience with that and some of their capabilities. And we're going to look at all that in the course of our proceeding. How do we prioritize? Are there cuts that we make? That's why we're proposing to do it, I think, rather than moving directly to it today.
I kind of have a repeat of the question I asked Chairman Pai. He wouldn't confirm, he said he was still considering whether he would go forward and appeal the Third Circuit case to the Supreme Court. You've said before that the FCC should. Do you still think that, Commissioner O'Reilly? And Commissioner Carr, do you think the FCC should appeal it to the Supreme Court?
I do still believe the same. I tend to kind of follow that path.
I mean, you could have gotten new information. I don't know.
I'm not sure from whom, but yes, in this case.
You also think that it should be appealed to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think the reforms that the FCC put in place are worth fighting for. I mean, you can go on, I think it was on Twitter today during the meeting. I think, David, maybe it was you or someone had tweeted about some additional declines in local news gatherings. My colleagues talked about the importance of local news and information. We have to make sure that we are allowing the investments in this space that are needed. Again, newspapers have been struggling for a variety of reasons, starting with Craigslist years and years ago. But they saw a lot of competition from the digital space, and we have to update our rules for that more generally and incentivize investment here. And so I think the reforms that we did are right. I think they're worth fighting for, and I'd support a decision by the General Counsel's office to move forward seeking cert.
Okay, that said, a Supreme
That was a
Court.
pretty long answer, though. I mean,
That was a
I
long
gave you
answer. It was a
lot.
really good answer. I'm very happy. But the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is a long shot. I mean, for anybody, that's a long shot. So some broadcasters were saying to me the other day that the FCC shouldn't wait on that or bet on that, but instead take the 2018 Quadrennial Review NPRM, break a bunch of rules out of it that they want to pass or that you want to pass, and just approve them on their own. For instance, subcaps. Just approve subcaps as its own standalone animal. Is that something that would be viable or that you would support?
Well, I mean, if we're talking radio subcaps, I'm a fan.
I know
of
you like them,
of
but can you
providing some
pass them
relief
on
there.
their own?
It's an interesting question. I'm happy to take it back. I do think, fundamentally, the General Counsel's office is going to be consulted here on their
Former
views.
General Counsel Brendan Carr.
Right. Yeah. And as General Counsel, I always advise people to listen to their lawyers when their lawyers are wearing the lawyer hat, and I'll follow that advice on the client end of that at this point.
Fair.
Yeah, there's a lot of puts and takes that go into the Supreme Court granting cert. Obviously, it's traditionally less than 1% of cases. If you just look at every single case that comes up, I think there are some unique features to this particular one. But I leave it to the General Counsel's office and their recommendation in terms of part of the input that the Chairman's office and others would need to make, whether to actually pull the trigger and go that direction or pursue different routes. But I do think there are openings for us to engage in reforms on the media side that we're not full stop in that effort. For instance, obviously, we engage in some media modernization reforms today.
I would answer your question this way. If it didn't interfere with potentially having to seek a case at the Supreme Court, and it was legally permissible, and take advice from the General Counsel's office on that, I would be more than happy to break it up into different pieces. I was there when we crafted the review, the 202H that we're fighting over for the last 20 some odd years. And at the time, we thought that was a mechanism to facilitate not only reform but also timely reform. But if it's permissible to break it into tiny pieces, then I'd be okay with that and supportive of that. But I only make one edit to your earlier comment on subcaps. I actually don't like subcaps. I want them to go away.
Well, that's true. I said it wrong.
All right, okay.
Real quick, what are the pros and cons of banning free handsets in the Lifeline program?
I'm sorry, what's that?
The pros and cons of banning free handsets in the Lifeline program?
Have we banned?
This was
It's a proposal?
It was added to the item. I think one of our colleagues can speak to you about teeing up some questions about handsets in the supply chain item.
I don't know if we're talking about Lifeline minimum standards, or are we talking about?
The FNPRM from last week?
Yeah, the Lifeline minimum standards item that was
No, no, no,
adopted,
the-
or
the-
the supply chain?
At this point.
Okay. What?
There was an report and order and FNPRM a week ago Thursday that was released, and it tees up questions about
Yeah, right.
whether providers should be banned from offering free handsets.
Yeah, the pros and cons were, that's why we have a record, and we'll let people file.
So you don't have opinions yourselves?
Well, I think I want to see what the record is. I have lots of opinions on a lot of things.
Let me ask a quick follow-up on C-band. There have been a lot of C-band questions today during the press conferences. You know, it seems like it takes a long time to schedule and get everything right, and this is a very complicated auction. Does it seem plausible that the FCC is going to be able to start an auction next year on the C-band?
Yes, and I think that's what some of the pushback you saw from some quarters, with some people cited, the Spectrum Act of 2012, and then a 3-year lag between that decision and some of the spectrum auctions at the FCC. We're not in that situation. Again, the speed gap between a private auction and a public auction has closed tremendously at this point, such that if we were to have gone a private auction, it would be a 2020 auction. Now that we're going a public auction, we're working to get that auction done in 2020, which is the right call. So I think generally I understand the concern about speed. It was a factor that I considered a lot. But when that gap has narrowed so significantly, it becomes less important when you start to weigh overall lots of other considerations, litigation risks, your faith in particular entities to be able to carry out the transaction. We look at a lot of different considerations then.
I would answer this way, and to Commissioner Carr's point, I think that delta only shrinks if the existing licensees are willing participants, and it's a voluntary structure. I think litigation can stretch that out, and so the timing of next year's auction, in my opinion, is still to be determined. I'm certainly hopeful it'll be next year. I've been pushing for speed since day one. The need to get critical mid-band spectrum out there, the need to have this particular band, given how it's treated internationally for 5G services, and the harmonization and what, I just came back from in Egypt. Everyone is talking about what they're doing in mid-bands. Very few people are talking about the high bands. The only conversation we had about high bands was how to stick it to the United States. So, I'm sensitive to all of that. And so I'm intrigued to see and look forward to seeing all of the participation that gets us to an auction next year. There are other auctions that I've been participating, in my 6 years at the commission that I've watched that aren't able to be executed in 6 or 9 months. That is not something that I've necessarily seen. And I point to the CBRS auction where we made decisions one year. We then did the MPRM the next year. We're going to have the auction the following year. So I think history says it can take quite a little bit longer than people have suggested just recently. But I'm anxious to see if we can make it that, if we dedicate all the resources and the software and everything that goes into the equation, can it work? I'm anxious to see it work because I want the auction to happen as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Any other questions, or we'll let you get to lunch? John Donnelly? No? Okay, thank you.
More programming. Thank you.
I know you didn't think that. I'm just making sure.
That's why I'm asking questions.
All right.
2:30.
I know, let's do it.
Let's go fast.
Yeah.
Hopefully not a record we'll break.
I don't know if I need caffeine or if I just feel punchy. Okay.
These questions will perk you up.
I can already tell.
Yeah,
I can already
I
tell.
feel confident that I know both of your feelings about whether the FCC should keep going to the Supreme Court, but if you want to talk about that, that'd be cool too. But do you think that the proposal to break out pieces of the quadrennial review and run them on their own, as in the example of the subcaps, do you think that that's something the FCC can or should do?
Depending on how you count, it is the third or fourth time that the Third Circuit has shipped our media ownership handiwork back to this agency. You don't have to know a lot about appellate courts, but that means they are not satisfied. I think the agency just has to get to work, respond to the court, and work on the issues that we failed to do so, including issues related to minority and women ownership of these properties and identifying a way that media ownership can be more diverse in the future.
Yeah, and from my part, back when I was at the Department of Justice, I actually did practice law, and I've stood in court and said, I'm Jeffrey Starks for the United States. And I can assure you that a court never had to tell me 4 times something. And so I am just gobsmacked that we know that strict scrutiny does not mean strict in fact. And so the court has told us 4 times to collect data on our ownership that makes it clear that we need to figure out the impact to communities of color and women, and we need to go ahead and do that.
Thank you.
I had Howard Busker come daily. I had 2 unrelated questions. One was, we just got done talking about, you might have heard the C-band question, but are you guys concerned that, or both of you concerned that it's going to be difficult to get an auction scheduled and, started in 2020? Because given the track record, it seems like that's a pretty ambitious timeline.
I think the broader problem is that the agency has organized its spectrum policy approach for 5G in exactly the wrong order. We have focused on high-band spectrum. In fact, the first 5 auctions we're holding for the 5G era involve only millimeter wave bands. The rest of the world is not doing that. We are far behind when it comes to mid-band spectrum. And we slowed down the 3.5 gigahertz band as well. I feel like the broader problem is that the United States is falling behind on mid-band spectrum because we've put our airwaves auctions in the wrong order. So now we have this challenge associated with the C-band. Because for a long time, this agency decided to try to experiment with the possibilities of holding a private sale rather than a public auction. But it's become apparent that the chairman no longer thinks that's viable. In addition, we're seeing lots and lots of legislation on Capitol Hill involving this subject. So we're going to have to pull all that together and figure out how we can proceed as fast as we can, consistent with whatever new laws we may have governing these airwaves.
Yes, and I said back in September that I thought a public auction was the way to go. I said in October that I thought a public auction was the way to go. And so I'm glad that the chairman now says a public auction is the way to go. And so I do think that practically the burning question now is to make sure that we get it done as quickly as practicable.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you both about was, so I'm hearing from some of the public safety officials who were concerned about the 911 order that one of the big concerns is that the FCC was looking at doing, working on dispatchable location, and they're afraid that now with this mandate that, that they're kind of forgetting about dispatchable location, and that could be the end of dispatchable location, at least under this administration. Is that something that you have been thinking about, or is that something on your minds?
They're right. That's a significant fear. And if you comb through the text of our decision, you will have every reason to suspect that we are done and that we are not, in fact, going to make dispatchable location and truly actionable location available for our nation's 911 operators and first responders. That's a problem. Go ahead and read our record. There are 911 operators from all around the country complaining that getting a raw string of numbers involving height above ellipsoid does nothing for them to tell someone where to head in an emergency. I think what the agency adopted today is simply not good enough. And I, like a lot of those first responders and public safety officials, am worried that we have a ways to go, but we might not have the energy to get there. We have to, because there is not truly an ability to locate a wireless 911 caller with the decision we made today. There is not one public safety answering point in this country that can use that raw data and help locate an individual in distress. We've got a lot more work to do, and if we stop here, that's a really big problem for public safety and for everyone who ever picks up the phone to dial 911.
You know, Jessica and I don't always see eye to eye. It's okay, it happens. You know, I voted for the item today. I know that public safety is not unanimous on the role that we took a vote on here today, but I have heard from enough public safety officials and enough of the public safety community that I'm confident that I voted for today's item. I do think that there's more work to do, and we need to get to a better place where people get to the right floor every time, each time. And so there is more work to do, but I did vote for today's item. I think there's enough there that makes sure that we have got to start saving lives right now.
Thank you.
Wait, I do want to reiterate one point. There is not one 911 call center today that can take the raw numbers in height above ellipsoid and translate them into actionable, dispatchable location information. If we acted in this room today like the job is done, then we lied to you. And I'm afraid that our decision was dishonest about whether or not this information is actionable. And the fact that so many 911 operators wrote into the agency and wrote to my office telling me they were distressed that we would organize around information they could not use, I think is a testament to the fact that, even as my colleague acknowledged, we have a lot more work to do.
Thank you.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about FCC's role and authority in, you know, helping with the security around next year's elections, and also what kind of role you might play in the census?
You know, why don't I talk about the census, because I've written about that, and then you've talked a lot about election security today. I think what is most striking about the 2020 census is it is the first digital-first census we're holding in this country. In other words, we intend to collect our information from people online. And there's so many reasons that that makes sense. We live in a digital world. So many people have a phone in their palm, pocket, or purse at any given time. But here's the thing. Because we've decided to make this digital first, the Census Bureau has hired 125,000 less door-to-door census takers. Think about that fact. And then also recognize that we have whole communities in this country struggling under the weight of a digital divide. They don't have online access. They don't have wireless services. How are we going to reach them? The census is the single most important way we divide up power in this country because it dictates where congressional representation takes place and what funds are made available to congressional districts for healthcare, infrastructure, education, you name it. Our failure to grapple with the realities of the digital divide and the census is going to be a problem, and we've got to start doing so right now. I think the administration has a lot of work to do on this score.
Is there time to do that work?
We are behind the game. The assumption that this will all work well seems dishonest and unfair. We talk in this building all the time about a digital divide. We talk about the communities that aren't connected. How are we going to reach them with a digital-first census? We have plans to try to make sure that we touch those communities that don't have access. Are they good enough? Will they work? What do they entail? We've never done this before, and the consequences are really stark. We have got to start working on this, and I think this agency should help with its own resources and work with the Department of Commerce to do so.
Can you mention one proposal that you either have in the works or would like to recommend?
I think the first things first, this agency is an authority on the scope of the digital divide. We have information about where service is and is not in this country. And I think that we, in effect, have a map of the places that are least likely to be connected. We should be working with our colleagues at the Department of Commerce to make sure they're aware of it, because they have too few resources to devote to this problem. I'd like us to start there and start with the Department of Commerce.
Thank you.
Yes, and so to your question on election security, the research shows that there are 5 states that are using the same networks that we use for our mobile devices. They are transmitting election results. And so that gives me great worry. I have no, it is quite clear in my mind that I am not an FEC commissioner, but I can assure you that an FEC commissioner does not know much about IMSI catchers and stingrays. And so there are vulnerabilities that we know for people that are using, again, what appears to be insecure voting equipment. And so this is an issue that I am going to be focused on. And I think, now that we're in primary season, we need to make sure that our elections, we're having a primary on the security that we can have to have a secure election going forward.
And I guess the same question, do you think there's time to make these?
That's why I'm focused on it right now.
And give me an example of one thing that you propose.
Well, I mean, very clearly, folks at every level need to know the vulnerabilities of if they're using, the people that are using these 1,000 insecure election machines. They need to know, and they need to start thinking through this. Like I said, I've started to call each of the major carriers into my office to talk about what they're doing, what they're thinking, how they're going to help assure me that they are thinking and working through with county officials and local officials. The fact of the matter is that running elections is a local matter. There is no quibbling about that. What I want to do is make sure that folks at every level are focused on the vulnerabilities that may come from connecting to networks.
And do you have the authority to make these kind of asks? Does the FCC have that authority?
I mean, we have authority over if there are folks that are using IMSI catchers and if election results are susceptible to vulnerabilities because they're transmitting them over stingrays. I think that's for sure something that I am going to speak out on. I'm going to make sure folks are aware of. As an American citizen, as somebody who views the integrity of our democracy as chief among the tasks that I took when I was sworn in, and certainly as somebody who has control and jurisdiction and authority over networks. I think this is something that has to be dealt with.
Thank you, Commissioners. I have 2 questions. So the first is, what would you like to see the ICT task force take on, the CISA ICT supply chain task force take on in year 2 of its work? And the second question is, to follow up on your comments, Commissioner Rosenworcel, this morning from, or noting that the BIS has repeatedly extended its license on the Huawei listing, on the entities list. I wonder if you have any initial reaction to cybersecurity companies saying they're concerned that the listing of Huawei on the entities list hampers their ability to share information on threats and vulnerabilities with Huawei.
All right. 2 issues. I'll start with the ICT task force. First and foremost, this agency, which oversees commercial networks in this country, needs to be an executive member of that task force. We sit at the table, but we are not part of the executive team. And given our authority, I think that's crazy. We need to fix that. I don't believe to date that the FCC has substantially participated in providing documentation or any kind of prioritization of their work product of the ICT task force. I want to change that. It starts with us being a part of the executive committee. With respect to specific tasks, I think we have to migrate from a discussion about equipment and ripping and replacing to what does the long-term future of 5G networks look like? And we have got to figure out how every arm and organization of the government that cares about this can help participate in developing standards for open radio access networks. The virtualization of that component of the network represents the future of equipment diversity, and that means it represents the future of security. In addition, I think that task force should do a lot more work going forward on the Internet of Things. We've got billions and billions of devices headed our way, and I long ago proposed a totally new and novel idea, which is we use the FCC's equipment authorization process as a gateway to increase discussion about security vulnerability of these devices. And we don't have to make it all up by ourselves. We can borrow the playbook from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies to do so. Now, your second question, I believe, involved the cognitive dissonance between the FCC this week deciding that these vendors cannot participate in the Universal Service Program because they represent a national security threat. And the fact that this week, for the third time, the Bureau of Industry and Standards extended the general license for companies in this country to work with those very same vendors. Stand back from a distance. What you can see is there is no big picture national plan when it comes to 5G security. I don't dispute what you mentioned, that we have to think about this and the security related in the near term of continuing those contracts, but we need a master plan. We don't have one. This was acknowledged as much in the pages of the Wall Street Journal when they wrote about the agency, this agency and other parts in Washington tripping over themselves and getting into conflict when it comes to 5G. And you saw it again this week when the bipartisan chairs of the Intelligence Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Armed Services Committee, and the Homeland Security Committee all wrote the White House asking for a national plan for 5G security. We don't have one, and we need one stat.
From my perspective, I think we need to organize here at the FCC better. And as I laid out in my statement, I'm calling for a national security task force here. We need to make sure there are many bureaus and divisions around the FCC that have individual pieces. And we can no longer afford on critical issues of national security for one hand to not know what the other hand is doing. And so I am going to be consistently calling for the FCC to have a more collaborative, more intentional effort to make sure that we are focusing on national security, because I know somebody asked the question earlier. From my perspective, there is no doubt that we are going to continue to see national security issues raised here at the FCC.
Hi, Commissioners. Todd Shields, Bloomberg News. I've had an opportunity to ask Commissioner Rosenworcel that she may want to take another swing at it. Mr. Starks, where are you with the public auction for C-band, and what kind of a reimbursement or payment should go to the companies?
Yes, and so, as I said, based upon my study of the policy, based upon my study of the legality and the statutory authority, I said in September, as early as September, that I thought a public auction was what I was calling for. And then I know at last month's presser here, I said again, quite clearly that a public auction is where I was. And so, each of us as commissioners has the ability to call balls and strikes. I'm glad that the chairman has come to see a strike that I have been calling a strike for some time. And so I'm calling for a public auction. In terms of, what are actual numbers that we're going to need to get to incentivize people to actually clear this spectrum, that is something that's going to have to play itself out. We certainly know that they had their own vision of numbers that they were going to hit or that they hoped to hit based upon some of their private auction plans. But now that it seems we're in public auction territory, that's going to be something that's going to have to play itself out.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Two really quick ones. I know it's getting late. So one on the 5.9 gigahertz MPRM. I know it's early, but do you just generally, do you agree with this idea of splitting it, or as opposed to continuing the testing to sharing? I'm going to ask you that one first.
Well, I'm going to just start by saying I am pleased that at long last we are going to have a rulemaking considering how we make public use of the 5.9 gigahertz band. It has been 20 years since we set it aside for dedicated short-range communication service. And in that time, we have not seen that service and the auto safety It entails really get deployed on the road. So taking a fresh look at this right now, seeing if we can do things simultaneously for auto safety and unlicensed spectrum seems like a good thing. It's something certainly I've been working with Commissioner O'Reilly on for 4 or 5 years, and I am glad to see that the chairman is a recent convert.
Yes, and so on 5.9, I'm also eager for us to go ahead and move. I could not agree more with Commissioner Rosenworcel there. And so eager to see what the chairman sets before us.
And then just briefly on the Montana example that you raised as well, do either one of you think it would be necessary to prioritize certain infrastructure like around the bases?
This is a really good question, and I can't speak for my colleague who was drawn to the same example as I was. But I think that this record is going to provide us with an opportunity to identify where this equipment is, how recently it was put into the network, and whether or not those locations are adjacent to sensitive places like military installations. I think we're going to have to comb through the record and identify that, because as we make plans for its replacement, we may need to identify where we start first. And that's something I think we should take into consideration.
I too think that the record is going to have to be developed on this. This is multivariable calculus here, and the fact of the matter is that obviously there could be some priority as you get closer to military bases, but the fact of the matter is when you talk to a lot of these carriers, they also tell you for a lot of these places you're in the most remote areas. There are very limited windows and times and opportunities where you can even actually get out to stations, and weather plays a role, terrain plays a role. And so this is going to have to be part of a collaborative working with the small rural carriers who have untrustworthy equipment in their infrastructure. And so the record's going to have to be developed to to figure out where we're going to prioritize, where we need to go first, where it's practical to actually get first. All of this is going to have to be something we figure out.
Done?
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness. What is that? Lunch at almost 3 o'clock. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.